Something doesn't add up here, and it's been bugging me for weeks. How did Native American tribes survive in places where even modern technology fails? In this video, I'm sharing the unbelievable truth about these ancient survival masters that will blow your mind. What you're about to discover will literally change how you see human potential forever. This journey into their secret world starts now. But before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more mind-blowing history, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The coast breathes differently when you know its old names. Before the barbed wire traced lines across the hills, before towns carved valleys into parcels of property, before rancherias were created to contain what the state could not understand, there were people who listened to the fog, who spoke with the rivers, who shaped their lives not in defiance of nature, but in devotion to it. Along the ragged cliffs where the Bear River meets the sea, before it was ever called Bear River, the Matole and Wiyot people lived by rhythms older than timepieces. Their world was not mapped, but remembered. Not bought, but inherited through water, wind, and the stories that came at twilight, when the redwoods hummed low and the stars returned like distant kin. The air was salt-heavy, even inland. The fog moved like breath between the trees, dressing the ferns and cedar roots in silver. It was not simply weather, it was sustenance. Fog watered the plants when the sun could not. It softened the forest's silence, allowing voices to pass between generations without echo or interruption. Here, survival was never an emergency. It was a practice. Every creek had a use, every tide its season, every root its story. And the people, the Matole, who lived along the Lost River valleys to the south, and the Wiyot along the northern bays and estuaries, moved with this land like language spoken without hesitation. When the salmon ran, the people gathered. The Eel River turned thick with mussel and silver, the water breaking with the slap of tails and the sudden gleam of sun on scale. Spearfishing was not a hunt, but a rite, passed from grandfather to grandson, from the curve of bone hooks carved in winter to the angle of the wrist needed to strike true. Fish were never taken without song. Smokehouses near the rivers filled the evening with the scent of alder and cedar, and the people stored not just food, but time. Months of survival banked against the leaner seasons. Women worked the acorn groves high in the hills, shaking the oak branches with woven poles until the nuts rained down like memory. They leached out the tannins with patient hands, using baskets so finely woven they could hold water. These baskets, made from willow, beargrass, and bracken fern, told stories in their patterns. A grandmother could teach her lineage through the weave. Some baskets held food, others held fire coals, but all of them held knowledge, the kind that doesn't come from reading, but from repetition and reverence. Along the ridgelines, shelters were shaped from redwood slabs, not cut, but gathered. The people did not see the forest as raw material. The trees were beings of memory, spirit, and weather. The houses faced east when possible, to catch the morning warmth and honor the coming of light. Inside, family lines gathered around central hearths, speaking in dialects that danced like wind through branches, subtle, tonal, tied to place. The Wiyot named themselves after their river, Wiyat, and the great bay they called Wigi. Their territory stretched along the lowlands, the salt marshes, and the islands where ceremonies lit the fog like lanterns of breath. The Matole, more inland and coastal mountain dwelling, kept to the hidden valleys and long trails that twisted like old stories into the spine of the King Range. Their lands met at the river mouths and trade routes. They shared basketry styles. They intermarried. They fought, but rarely. The real battle was always with time and hunger, not each other. Ceremony was not something set apart from life. It was woven into it. A walk to gather pine nuts became a way to speak with ancestors. A fire lit in the center of a camp was a way to summon memory. Stories were not told to entertain. They were told to remember the creation of the animals, the shape of the stars, the names of the winds. There was a story for each thing lost, so it would not vanish completely. One story told of a time when the animals could speak, and the people understood them. Another told of the first people, who shaped the hills with their footprints and hid medicine in the roots for those who would come later. Each tale held more than moral. It held location. Memory was not abstract. It had coordinates. A bend in the river, a hollow in the tree, a ridge where mist lingered longer than it should. There were no fences. Boundaries were marked by understanding, not conquest. You knew which hill was sacred because your grandmother wept when she climbed it. You knew which spring was forbidden because your uncle once disrespected it and paid in fever. Rights were inherited through story and silence, not signatures. And so, when maps began to arrive, drawn by strangers with no memory of the fog, something ancient began to falter. But for now, in this time before the ink and the rifles, life held. A mother taught her daughter how to bind plant fibers into cord strong enough to carry a basket of fish. A father showed his son the proper way to face the river, not with hunger, but gratitude. Elders sat beneath bent pines and recited names, not just of people, but of stones, of paths, of winds that only came once each moon. Even the silence was full here, of wings, of rain, of breathing earth. The coastal prairies were grazed not by cattle, but by elk. Deer crept through the shadowed underbrush, their tracks followed not with rifles, but with the whisper of moccasins on pine needle. Traps were baited with patience. Bows were strung with sinew and respect. A kill was not a victory. It was a responsibility. Medicines grew in unlikely places. Yarrow on cliffs, angelica in floodplains, mugwort by the sea. Healers did not call themselves such. They simply knew when to harvest, knew what the dreams meant, knew that illness was not just of body, but of spirit, and they knew, most of all, how to listen. But even then, even in this moment of near-perfect equilibrium, the first signs came. A trail widened where no trail had been. A tree was felled, not with reverence, but for profit. A cough spread through a village, carried from a passing trader. The ocean winds brought rumors of men who wore metal, who cut down forests not to survive, but to ship away, of people who did not speak to rivers, only over them. The elders spoke more often at night now, in low tones, and so this world shaped by salmon, smoke, and stories, began to gather its breath, not in fear, but in memory, knowing that soon, remembering would become the most vital survival skill of all, because when the maps came, they would not show the berry trails, or the singing stones, or the shelter tree where a mother once gave birth during a storm. They would not speak the names whispered into baskets or carved into redwood roots. They would not recognize the sacred bends in the rivers. But the people would, and they would carry it, not in books or flags, but in bone, in language, and in ceremony. Even when the fences came, even when the rancheria was born out of broken promises, even when silence became their only protection. Because the fog still comes, the river still sings, and beneath the noise of history, the land remembers. So do they. The hills did not echo with cannon fire. They whispered, with boots on fern beds, with wagon wheels cracking through redwood roots, with men who spoke in maps and money. The gold had not come to the Bear River coast, not directly. But gold rarely travels alone. It brings hunger, and hunger brings men, and men bring iron. In 1849, the mountains east of here caught fire with greed. By 1850, the flame had reached the sea. There was no announcement, no formal claim of conquest, just the slow, unrelenting arrival of strangers who built cabins where sweat lodges once steamed. Strangers who cut trails through sacred deer paths, who looked at the redwoods not as cathedral or ancestor, but as timber. To the Bear River people, Matole and Wiyot, the change was not immediate, but it was irreversible. At first, it was a rumor, told between acorn pounding and basket weaving. Then it was a trail widened overnight. Then it was an entire stand of trees, missing. The strangers didn't ask. They staked. They posted signs in a language no elder could read, claiming parcels of land like carving up meat at a feast. And those who stood in the way were not moved. They were erased. The people tried to remain unseen, to retreat deeper into the folds of the forest. Women gathered wild roots by night. Men fished at dawn before gunshots could echo across the water. They buried sacred tools beneath moss beds. They taught children to walk silently, not just because the elk would flee, but because the wrong sound could bring death. Then came the militias. Some were state-sanctioned. Others were just gangs of armed settlers who saw any native presence as threat, or worse, inconvenience. They called themselves protectors of progress. Their victims were grandmothers shelling acorns, boys hunting rabbit, dancers preparing for ceremony. February 26, 1860. Moonlight washed over Tuluwa Island in Humboldt Bay, the ceremonial heart of the Wiyot world. For days, the people had gathered there for their sacred world renewal ceremony, offering dance and prayer to restore balance between land and spirit. The women had laid down pine boughs. The elders had begun chants not heard in a generation. The children had fallen asleep beneath stars that watched over them like ancestors. And that night, as the tide rose, so did the knives. White men rowed across the bay in silence. Their rifles had been cleaned. Their boots were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. They landed at the edge of the island and walked toward the sleeping camp with no warning, no words. They did not shoot. They slit throats. Women, children, infants in cradles. One mother was found with her arms still wrapped around her baby, her body torn open, her child dead beside her. Over 80 Wiyot people were killed on that island. The men of the tribe, who had gone to gather supplies across the bay, returned to smoke and silence. The Wiyot massacre of 1860 was not the only attack. That same week, militias descended on Matoli and Bear River settlements as well, executing coordinated raids. In the valleys where songs once guided harvests, the cries of the dying replaced ceremony. Bodies were buried quickly, some not at all. The settlers called it cleansing. The survivors called it apocalypse. For those who lived, survival became fugitive. Villages were abandoned, trails forgotten, children hidden in bare grass. A whole generation learned how to disappear, not out of cowardice, but because it was the only form of resistance left. They became ghosts in their own homeland, hunted for the crime of having existed before fences. Some carried seed bundles sewn into belts, wild onion, blue camas, coastal sage, ancestral medicines meant to one day find ground again. Others kept stories, whispered beneath blankets when no one else could hear. Stories of the salmon who would return, of the grandmothers who walked with medicine bundles on their backs, of the redwood giants who remembered everything. The newcomers did not see this. They saw emptiness, land ready for the taking. They cut down groves without knowing that a child had been buried at its roots. They built roads through deer trails that had been traveled for centuries. They plowed fields where old sweat lodges had healed the sick, and they wondered why the land did not welcome them. Some tribes tried to negotiate, signing agreements they could not read, trusting men in uniforms with promises like peace and fair exchange. But those promises burned like kindling. The ink dried, the soldiers left, and the people were told they had no more rights. Not to the land, not to ceremony, not even to their names. For the Bear River people, the land became both prison and sanctuary. They knew which gorges held water through drought. They knew which caves echoed too sharply to risk sleeping in. They passed down survival not as a skill, but as an inheritance. A grandmother taught her granddaughter how to listen for the settlers' dogs, how to read the tilt of a crow's wing to know when danger approached. A father carved a fishing spear out of driftwood, binding it with sinew, not to feed a village, but to catch one meal for one night in one hidden cove. There were no more feast dances, only the rhythm of evasion. They did not fight back with armies. They fought back with memory. They hid basket patterns in the corners of blankets, knowing one day they would be rewoven. They sang lullabies in Wiyot and Matola dialects, even when the children could not answer back. They refused to forget. One woman, whose name is lost to records but not to memory, is said to have walked alone through the redwoods every new moon, carrying a single feather and a prayer for each person taken. She walked until her hair went white. Her footprints, never recorded, still mark the paths along the Bear River hills, known only to her kin. In those years, there were no victories, only breath, only the next step, only the stubbornness to still be alive when others wished you vanished. But even that, even the refusal to vanish, was a kind of revolution. By the 1870s, many of the villages had been razed. What remained were whispers of old trails, of fishing sites now beneath cabins, of ceremony grounds turned cattle fields. But the people were not gone. They had simply moved deeper, into forest, into memory, into resistance. They carried their nation in silence, in calloused hands, in the small fire kindled at night with no smoke, in the handful of earth taken from the grave of a mother and stored in a pouch for 40 winters. And when the census takers came, with their clipboards, their questions, their assumptions, they found nothing, no tribe, no name, no language. But they were wrong, because there, just beyond the last surveyed hill, a child was being taught how to strip willow bark. A man was teaching his son how to set a trap that wouldn't leave tracks. A woman was weaving a basket that looked like moss but could carry fire. The Bear River people had not vanished. They had turned survival into ceremony. And one day, when the land was ready, they would return. The gold had taken much, but it had not taken everything. Not yet. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was absence. The forests that once echoed with song and ceremony were quiet now, interrupted only by the distant sound of logging saws and the low hiss of steam trains pushing deeper into the redwood country. For the Matole and Wiyot survivors, what remained of the Bear River people, there were no treaties, no agreements, no formal words of surrender. They had not been conquered in the eyes of history, only forgotten. In the ledgers of the federal government, they were marked not as tribes, but as shadows. Landless Indians, remnants, wanderers. Words typed in cold ink that stripped away the truth, that they were still here, still enduring, still raising children beneath redwood boughs and beside the muddy edges of rivers that once ran clear with salmon. But to be forgotten by the state meant more than insult. It meant erasure. No land grants, no federal assistance, no right to hunt where they had hunted for centuries, no legal standing to reclaim stolen places or perform sacred rites without risking arrest. In a nation built on property and paper, the Bear River people had neither. So they became invisible. Along the gravel backroads of Humboldt County, families camped in brush shelters near logging mills, taking what work they could find. Men labored with splintered hands, swinging axes from dawn to dusk for a few coins and a chance to sleep by the fire in peace. Women gathered firewood from the forest edges, their eyes always watching for patrolmen or settler dogs. Children grew up in the margins, not quite citizen, not quite outlaw, not Indian by recognition, only by memory. They slept under railroad trestles. They huddled beside creeks where the water was still clean enough to drink. They squatted on unclaimed hillsides, building lean-tos from cast-off canvas and scavenged lumber. Some blended into logging towns like Scotia or Rio Dell, posing as Mexican laborers, or simply never speaking the old names aloud. Others clung to the forest, hiding tools and stories in the hollows of stumps. This was not the kind of survival that makes for legends. It did not come with war paint or battle cries. It came with hunger, with cold, with the quiet dignity of a mother boiling roots in a coffee tin, humming a lullaby in Wiyot to a child wrapped in potato sacks. It came with the endurance of a grandfather who knew that even if the language had no place in the courthouse, it could still be passed around the fire. Word by word, night by night. One such man was named Eli, his last name never recorded. He lived near the edge of the Eel River in a dugout shelter patched with oilcloth and moss. His hands, once skilled in shaping redwood canoes, now worked tying fishing lines for white tourists. But in his satchel, beneath the hooks and bait, he kept a carved bone whistle. It had been passed down through 3 generations, used in dances when the moon was high and the ancestors were near. Eli never used it anymore, not in the open. But some nights, when the wind covered sound, he would blow it once, soft and low, just to remind the land that he was still here. There were others like him. A woman named Lila, half blind and nearly voiceless, wove baskets in a shed behind a Eureka General Store. She used pine needles and bear grass gathered in, secret. She never sold them. She traded them to other Indian women, for smoked fish, for news, for memory. Her baskets were small. She called them bones because she said they held the shape of what had been buried. An entire generation lived in this space between worlds, too Indian to be accepted, too undocumented to be recognized. Children were sent to boarding schools if they were discovered. Their hair was cut, their tongues punished. Some never returned. The people who remained learned to hide in plain sight. A deer hide was cut into strips and turned into bootlaces. A sacred pipe was stored in a mason jar under the floorboards. Songs were taught without words, only hums, only gestures, shared between parent and child like secrets too dangerous to speak. And still, the land remembered. Despite the fences, despite the mills and mines, the Bear River hills held echoes. Certain trees would split open in the rain, revealing caches of stone tools once hidden there by fleeing families. Wild onions still bloomed in the places women had wept. Salmon still returned to some bends of the river, as if looking for the hands that once lifted them with respect. By 1900, what was left of the Bear River Band was spread across canyons and campsites. No official gathering, no recognized council, only fragments. But then something changed. The federal government, under pressure to account for the Indian problem, began issuing small parcels of land, often on poor soil, far from water, barely inhabitable. These were not treaties. They were afterthoughts, a bureaucratic gesture to say, "We've done our part." In 1910, one such sliver was designated near a place called Ronaville, a narrow hillside above the Van Dusen River, steep and wind-battered, but unclaimed. The state called it a rancheria, a term borrowed from Spanish colonial days, meant to describe Indian enclaves without the rights of reservations. It was barely 10 acres. It had no running water. But it was something. For a people who had been invisible for 60 years, it was a crack in the wall. A few families came together, built makeshift homes with tar paper and driftwood, dug shallow wells, planted beans and corn in rocky soil. It was not a return, not yet, but a gathering. A place where, for the first time in a generation, a grandmother could speak her language aloud without fear. They called it Bear River. It was not the ancestral village. It was not even close to the ocean. But it was a place where stories could be told beside firelight, not whispered under blankets. It was a place where a boy could learn the old fishing knots from his uncle without watching the road every 5 minutes. A place where names began to return. Matole, Wiyot, Tolowa, not just in memory, but in flesh. Even then, the government barely noticed. No schools were built, no medical care offered. The land was marked as Indian land, but the people were still called stateless. They had no political body, no legal clout, but they had each other, and they had the stories. One elder said it best, We did not lose the land. We lost our place in their story. So we told our own. And in the folds of that windswept rancheria, no wider than a creek bend, no louder than a summer wind, the Bear River Band began to rise again. It would not be easy, the road ahead still twisted with erasure and resistance. But they had survived the silence. They had survived the forgetting. And now they had a place to remember. The shackles were still there, made of paper this time, not iron. But they had learned how to slip through chains. They had become a people of wind, of smoke, of root and whisper. And nothing rooted in the land ever truly disappears. The wind on the hills above Ronaville still carried the scent of pine pitch and memory, but the lines drawn through the earth had changed once again. In 1910, when the United States government established the Ronaville Rancheria, it was not a gift, it was a concession. A narrow, stony ribbon of land carved out above the Van Dusen River, declared just remote enough to matter to no one else. The Bear River people, still reeling from generations of displacement, took what was given not because it was enough, but because it was something. A place where fires could be lit again without fear of extinguishment. A place where names could be spoken aloud. For decades, the people held on. They built homes from lumber scraps and tin. They planted corn in soil so dry it cracked like bark. They dug shallow wells by hand. The homes weren't many, and they weren't large, but they were proof. Proof that the Bear River Band had endured. That even in the age of invisibility, something rooted had begun to grow again. But then came 1958. The policy was delivered in carefully chosen language, the California Rancheria Termination Act. It promised modernization, independence, freedom from federal oversight. The bill claimed to lift Native people out of dependency, to treat them as equals by removing the special relationship with the federal government. But beneath the political polish, it was a knife wrapped in paper. The act decreed that rancherias across California, including Ronaville, would be terminated. Federal recognition would be stripped. Trust lands would be dissolved, titles transferred into private hands. The government would no longer bear responsibility for infrastructure, for education, for health, or for protection. Tribes, in their eyes, would simply vanish from law. For the Bear River people, the notice didn't come with ceremony. It came in the form of mail, legal documents filled with language few could decipher. Words like fee simple title, relinquishment, and withdrawal of federal services. Many didn't even realize what was happening until surveyors arrived to carve the rancheria into parcels. Their parcels. But not as a tribe, as individuals. Some families were offered the choice to sell their land. Others were told they had no choice. There was pressure to relocate, to leave the hills, to join the flow of American life, into towns where native identity was expected to fade into paperwork and pavement. A woman named Clara, small-framed, silver-haired, the last fluent speaker of a dialect no official agency recorded, refused to sign. "They can break the law," she said, "but they cannot break the land." Her words were ignored. Her home, a hand-built lodge of redwood slab and tar paper, was bulldozed 2 months later under claims of unsafe habitation. What the government called progress, the people knew as dispossession. Again, what was promised as liberation felt instead like exile in slow motion. Without federal recognition, the Bear River Band became stateless once more. They could not apply for tribal grants. Their children were denied access to Indian education services. Clinics closed. Roads deteriorated. Housing assistance vanished. Elders who once received commodities or basic health supplies now found themselves walking miles to reach clinics that no longer accepted their tribal status. But perhaps the cruelest wound wasn't what was lost. It was the lie of it all. The illusion that this was empowerment, that their freedom came at the cost of everything that made them whole. And yet, they endured. Even as rancheria homes crumbled, even as language slipped further from memory, even as youth were pulled into urban centers where no one had ever heard the name Matole or Wiyot. Elders gathered, in kitchens dimly lit by kerosene lamps, on porches overlooking land now divided by county line, in the woods where no documents could follow. They met in secret. They read policy out loud. They asked questions. Who owns the land if the tribe is not real? Who protects the cemetery if the people are ghosts? Who keeps the stories if the names are gone? One man, Thomas B., a logger by trade, a firekeeper by blood, began collecting testimonies, not just of land loss, but of family, of songs, of fish runs. He wrote them in notebooks passed between cousins like medicine bundles. In his words, "The law erased our name, but we are still here, writing it back in ink made of memory." He wasn't alone. Across California, tribes who had been terminated began to rise. They studied legal code like scripture. They filed petitions. They gathered affidavits, maps, family trees drawn from memory and prayer. They found allies, some lawyers, some journalists, some just people who believed that history didn't always belong to the victors. For the Bear River Band, the fire of resistance smoldered slowly, quietly, but it never went out. In the 1970s, Native activism across the United States surged. The American Indian movement stood off at Wounded Knee. Indigenous scholars and leaders called out broken treaties, stolen land, and a system that still treated Native people as an inconvenience. It was in this national wave that the Bear River Band found its voice again, not in a courtroom, not in a protest, but in a meeting. A dozen families sitting beneath the same trees where their great-grandparents once gathered to trade stories and share fish. They spoke not in rage, but in resolve. "We never gave up our identity," one elder said. "They just buried it beneath the paper." The path to restoration would take decades more. Twists of legislation, moments of despair, fleeting hope in courtrooms where their names were mispronounced and their histories summarized in footnotes. But the work began here, in the shadow of a system that had once pretended they were free. And while the Ronaville Rancheria remained, its meaning changed. It was no longer just a scrap of land on a hillside. It was memory, it was proof, and it was the staging ground for a return not to the past, but to recognition on their own terms. The Rancheria system had tried to divide them, to cage them again, this time with contracts instead of chains. But in the cracks of that system, something sacred took root. A shared understanding that no document could define a people, no surveyor's stake could claim spirit. Recognition, without respect, is another form of colonization. But resistance, quiet, generational, rooted, is its antidote. And in the soil of the Bear River Hills, resistance grew wild. The fire hadn't gone out. It had only burned underground. For decades after the paper termination of the Bear River Band, the wind on the hillside still carried the smoke of quiet resilience. The federal government had struck their name from the rolls, revoked their land's protection, and declared them no longer a people. But inside the walls of wood stove-warmed homes and among redwoods that remembered everything, the tribe still stood. Not in the eyes of Washington, but in the marrow of those who refused to forget. They called it termination, a word meant to sound clean, bureaucratic, as if identity could be erased with a signature, as if the blood of salmon fishermen and basket weavers could be dried like ink. But the Bear River Band had other words: survival, return, fire. By the early 1980s, something began to stir. Not suddenly, like a storm, but slowly, like spring through old snow. It started in kitchens, where women brewed coffee over propane stoves and opened file boxes that had grown heavy with rejection letters. It started with elders sitting at worn tables, whispering names into tape recorders so their dialects wouldn't die in their sleep. It started with a memory of what had been taken and what might still be restored. In a small house above Fortuna, a grandmother named Ruth set up folding chairs in her living room. She was not a lawyer, not a chief, not even someone the government recognized as Indian anymore. But she had stories, and she had time. She brought in neighborhood children, many of them descended from Matole and Wiyot lines, and taught them what she remembered, words for rain, for deer, for the way a mother once hummed while preparing acorns. They sat cross-legged on the rug, listening, repeating, forgetting, and relearning. "We may be off the books," she once said, "but we're not off the earth." The tribe had no headquarters, no budget, no official voice. But they had binders filled with land deeds, burial records, eyewitness testimonies, and faded photographs marked with names no politician could pronounce. And they had people like Gerald, a logger turned legal assistant, who spent his nights writing letters to state offices, using library typewriters and carbon paper to copy every appeal. When the US government passed the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, it had seemed like a new beginning for many tribes, but it left out California's terminated rancherias, including Bear River. The Rancheria Termination Act of 1958 had been a hammer blow, declaring tribes free from their status, but also from their healthcare, land rights, and federal recognition. For Bear River, it was a cruel echo of what they'd endured a century before: disappearance by decree. But now, by the early 1980s, pressure was building. Across California, terminated tribes were beginning to push back. In Washington, lawmakers started to hear a low rumble, from tribal councils forming from memory, not policy. The Bear River Band joined others in this rising tide, filing for formal restoration under a series of lawsuits and acts of Congress. In 1983, after nearly 25 years in legal limbo, a breakthrough came. The US Congress passed the Restored Rancheria Act, officially titled the Tilley-Hardwick v. United States Settlement. It was a legal reversal of termination for 17 tribes in California, including Bear River. On paper, the tribe was reborn. What had been lost through politics and policy was now written back into law. But restoration wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. The ink said they were a tribe again. But what did that mean to a generation that had grown up in the margins, without counsel, without songs, without the legal right to gather together as a people? They had the name. Now they had to rebuild the body. A small trailer on the edge of the old rancheria became the new tribal office. It didn't have heat. Some days, it didn't have electricity. But inside, council members met, sitting on plastic chairs with clipboards, trying to reconstruct governance from memory and urgency. They needed everything: land use plans, enrollment criteria, economic development strategies, cultural programs. But first, they needed to figure out who they were, legally. Who could prove ancestry? Who had records that had survived the decades of silence? Paperwork was both shield and blade. Young adults who had grown up watching their parents toil without tribal status now found themselves writing grant applications. Youth like Natalie, who had once hidden her heritage in school, now spoke Wiyot phrases into microphones at public meetings. Elders who had buried their tongues now shared songs in classrooms. There was joy and grief, because for every song remembered, there were 10 that had been lost. But they moved forward. They organized cultural classes, language lessons, health clinics in mobile vans. They worked with other tribes to secure funding for salmon restoration along the Eel River. They planted native plants along fire-scarred hillsides. They started housing programs, economic ventures, and education outreach, not because it was owed to them, but because it had been denied for so long. One tribal leader, speaking at a community meeting in 1986, put it simply: "They tried to write us out. So now we write ourselves back in, one page at a time." And the work was not just administrative, it was spiritual. A smokehouse was built, overlooking the river. For the first time in decades, traditional dances were held again, not as performances, but as prayer. The fire burned clean and steady, fed by hands that knew how to tend it, even after years in the dark. Ceremonies that had once been whispers in the backwoods now echoed in open air. Children watched, and then joined. Not to reenact the past, but to step into a future where they didn't have to choose between the world outside and the blood within. For the Bear River Band, restoration was not a finish line. It was the striking of flint, the beginning of a flame that needed constant tending, through law, through education, through remembrance. It meant learning how to survive within systems designed to erase them, and turning those systems into tools of return. Not everything was fixed. The wounds of termination did not heal easily. There were debates, frustrations, stumbles, but there was also motion, forward, steady, sacred, and in the hills you could hear it, the sound of children singing in a language that once teetered on the edge of silence, the rhythm of hammers rebuilding homes on land once stolen, the voices of elders, once dismissed, now honoured as counsel. The Bear River Band had not simply been restored, they had reclaimed the fire within, and they still stand. The first smokehouse stood quiet at dawn, built from rough-hewn redwood slabs, nestled between mist-laced hills above the Van Dusen River. It didn't rise in fanfare or ceremony. There were no cameras, no press releases, only the scrape of stone on cedar, the creak of the frame, the silence of reverence. To the outside world, it might have seemed like just another structure, a shed tucked into a forgotten corner of Northern California. But to the Bear River Band, it was a beginning. Not a return, because what had been stolen could never fully be given back, but a beginning, a breath after generations of holding silence, a signal to the ancestors that their voices had not disappeared, only waited, buried deep in the blood. Restoration, after all, was not the end of anything. Recognition came with no map. The tribe had been named again on paper, yes, but paper does not carry ceremony. It cannot translate a song sung in Matol to a grandson born speaking only English. It cannot teach hands how to weave baskets from bear grass or which tide pool holds the medicine crab. Paper was politics, but the sacred lived in breath, in sweat, in flame. And so, the Bear River people turned inward. It started with questions. What stories had been left untold? What rhythms could still be remembered? What did it mean to be a tribe, not in theory, but in the smell of wood smoke and the taste of salt wind? Elders gathered, some with bent backs and cataracts, others who had stopped speaking their language aloud years ago, after the government had told them it was illegal to practice their traditions. They came carrying scraps, words, gestures, recipes, fragments of songs, and they sat in circles and began the work of remembering. A woman named Mary, born on the rancheria during the years of federal silence, began teaching young women how to prepare acorn meal the old way, not in metal pots, but with river stones. First, they'd gather the acorns from black oak stands high in the hills, where logging hadn't stripped everything bare. They'd lay them out to dry, then crack them open with stones, hand-pounded until the kernels broke clean. The leaching process took days. Water flowed over the ground acorns in a hollowed-out basin lined with pine needles, pulling out the bitterness, one slow drip at a time. A sacred act, disguised as a recipe. She didn't just teach cooking, she taught rhythm. She taught the silence between steps, when to pause, when to pray, when to listen for birds that once guided gathering paths. The girls asked why it took so long. Why not use a blender or a stove? Because, Mary said, we're not just feeding the body, we're waking up the ancestors. Elsewhere, a man named Leonard, one of the last fluent speakers of a coastal dialect no school had ever taught, took a group of boys down to the river to teach them redwood carving. They worked with bone chisels and modern knives alike, shaping miniature canoes and ceremonial paddles. They weren't building for the water, they were carving memory into wood. Each movement came with a word, not a translation, but an invocation. To carve was not just to shape, it was to ask permission. To burn was to honor. To float was to trust. Some of the boys laughed awkwardly at first, stumbling over the sounds. But over time, their hands grew steady. They began to speak without being asked. And in those words, not yet fluent, not yet whole, a language stirred awake. And then there were the dances, once forbidden, once hidden, now rising again, like the smoke that coiled from the newly built lodges during the cold season. The first gathering wasn't announced publicly. It happened on a cool autumn night, beneath a sky bruised with stars. A circle was drawn in the grass. A drum was brought out, its hide cracked from decades in storage. No one remembered the exact steps. There were no instructions, but someone began to move, and then another, and then the rhythm returned, not as a performance, not as entertainment, but as something elemental, a movement older than memory, stored in muscle and carried like breath. Children watched wide-eyed. Some joined, others stayed quiet, unsure what to feel. But they were there, and that was enough. Ceremony came back not all at once, but in flickers. A fog ceremony along the coast, where songs were sung into the mist to ask for clean water and safe passage for salmon. A naming ceremony for a newborn, where the family chose not an English name, but a traditional one. One not found in any book, but dreamed the night before by the grandfather. A funeral, where the body was wrapped in tulle mats, laid among cedar branches, and mourned with stories instead of silence. These were not reenactments. This wasn't a museum. This was survival. Cultural rebirth wasn't tidy. It came with pain. Some elders wept during ceremonies, not just out of joy, but grief. Grief for those who never lived to see this moment, for those who had to bury their traditions so deep that they forgot what they sounded like, for the children taken to boarding schools and never returned. And yet, each act of remembering became a weapon against that grief. A language class held in the tribal hall, where chalk traced old letters on modern boards. A food-gathering walk through the coastal forest, where teens learned to spot stinging nettle, soaproot, bay laurel. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter to hum the lullaby she once heard in secret, from a mother who had whispered it through fear. Not nostalgia, not performance, survival. And with survival came dignity, not granted, but reclaimed. The tribe began holding annual gatherings again, small at first, then larger. Drummers arrived from nearby nations. Dancers came in regalia stitched from deer hide, adorned with shells, carved feathers, woven colours that had not been seen in these hills for decades. The smokehouse became a centre, not just for ritual, but for decision. Council meetings held beside sacred flame, stories shared over the embers. Decisions made not in state offices, but in the presence of memory. A generation born into silence now raised its voice, and still they faced challenges. Some youth struggled to see the value in tradition, torn between a world of smartphones and ceremonies. Some elders still carried shame, scars from a time when speaking their language meant punishment, and outsiders still questioned their legitimacy, still called it quaint, still assumed the culture had been reduced to casino signs and newspaper headlines. But the fire was real. It burned in every smokehouse that rose again. It sang in every word spoken in the old tongue. It danced in the dust kicked up by feet that remembered what it meant to belong to the land. The Bear River Band did not return to who they were. They became who they are. Survivors turned teachers, fragments turned firelight. In the end, the smoke did not mark the end of the story. It marked the beginning of ceremony, of voice, of the sacred rising again. Not because it was allowed, because it was theirs. At sunrise, the council meets. They don't wear feathers or regalia. They wear work boots, flannel jackets, and the exhaustion of ancestors carried in the bones. Their circle is not carved in bark or stone, but drawn around a folding table in a modest tribal hall above the Van Dusen River, where a whiteboard leans against the wall and a coffee maker hums in the background. The setting is modern. The language of the day is policy, zoning, and grants, but beneath each word, each motion, lies something older, something sacred. This is what native sovereignty looks like now. After the Bear River Band regained federal recognition in the 1980s, the path ahead was not paved. It was tangled, uphill, and shrouded in decades of absence. The government had named them again, but had not restored what had been lost. Not the land, not the infrastructure, not the cultural continuity that forms the spine of any sovereign people. It was like being handed back the key to a house that hadn't stood in 60 years, and so they began to build. Not just homes, but systems. Not just memories, but futures. The Bear River Tribal Council, now a formal governing body, started with almost nothing. A trailer for an office, a small staff, a narrow budget cobbled together from federal grants, casino revenue, and local development funds. But they had something stronger than money, an urgency to make decisions for themselves, on their own land, with their own values. That meant navigating two worlds, one of ceremony, one of statute. They wrote charters and constitutions. They studied tribal law. They sought guidance from other restored tribes across California. And each decision, from education programs to health clinic hours, had to pass a silent test. Does this honor the people who walked here before us? It wasn't always easy. The Bear River Band today includes descendants of Matalay, Wiyot, and other regional peoples. Different clans, different traditions, different scars. Creating unified policy meant acknowledging those differences without letting them fracture identity. Tribal sovereignty required more than a legal framework. It required trust. At one early council meeting, a dispute arose over how to allocate funds from a federal housing grant. Some argued the funds should go toward modern infrastructure, water lines, roads, fire safety. Others wanted cultural priority, a language immersion program, or a youth longhouse. Tension rose, voices tightened. An elder named Sam, who had lived through both termination and restoration, stood and spoke quietly. If the ancestors had roads but no songs, would we still be here? The room fell silent. The decision was delayed. A compromise was found, both programs funded, one through tribal economic enterprise, the other through external grants. It wasn't just a political solution, it was a cultural one. Governing wasn't a return to old ways, it was the creation of new ways, guided by old truths. The tribe began investing in self-sufficiency, not out of ambition, but necessity. A tribal health center was built, modest in size but rooted in holistic values. Services included both Western medicine and traditional healing. Elders were consulted not just on cultural preservation, but on mental wellness. How grief passed through generations, how silence becomes sickness. Nearby, an educational program was launched, not only for children, but for adults. Classes in basket weaving, tribal law, forestry management, and language restoration. Some students were teenagers. Some were grandmothers, reclaiming what had been denied them in boarding schools. A boy named Julian, 17 years old, half Matole, half Mexican, said he never knew what sovereignty meant until he sat in a classroom and heard a councilwoman speak in Wiyot, her voice cracking with pride. That day, he went home and told his mother he wanted to be a lawyer, not for the state, but for the tribe. Economic growth became a delicate balance. The tribe opened a casino resort, a source of both funding and contention. The revenue allowed for more healthcare services, youth programs, and environmental projects. But not all were comfortable with what it represented. Lights, machines, money. Some elders worried it might pull the people away from sacred roots. Others saw it as modern trade, no different than trading baskets for shell beads generations ago. Again, the council weighed tradition against survival. And again, they chose both. The casino included artwork from local tribal artists, signs in native languages, funds earmarked for cultural preservation, economic sovereignty. For the Bear River Band, meant more than profit. It meant freedom to make their own mistakes. their own solutions. The biggest challenge was not building systems, it was holding on to spirit. How do you keep the sacred in the everyday? How do you pass down survival when it no longer looks like hunting and hiding, but like spreadsheets, permits, and legal motions? Council members began their meetings with a blessing, not for show, but to anchor the work. Youth were invited into discussions. Community circles were held not just on policy, but on grief, on hope, on future. In tribal court proceedings, decisions were made with awareness of tribal values, not just punitive justice, but restoration and belonging. They used fire again, not just in the smokehouse, but in controlled burns to restore native ecosystems. Fire crews trained tribal youth in traditional ecological knowledge, combining indigenous methods with modern safety protocols. Where the state had once seen destruction, the tribe saw healing. The land, too, began to respond. Hills once dry and degraded began to bloom again with native grass. Streams ran clearer. Deer returned to old paths. And with each step forward, the Bear River Band remembered what had always been true, that governance was not about power, but about care. That sovereignty wasn't a flag or a title, but a way of moving through the world, accountable not to a throne or a capital, but to the water, to the forest, to the faces of children not yet born. Tribal sovereignty didn't make headlines. It didn't come with fireworks. It came with a mother filling out housing forms so her daughter could grow up on ancestral land. It came with a young man planting yarrow on a hillside his great-grandmother once foraged. It came with a vote cast in a community hall that once was only a dream. Bear River Strong wasn't a slogan. It was a truth, carved in resilience, written in smoke, spoken in councils that echo not just with debate, but with memory. Because governance is sacred, and survival, in this chapter of the Bear River story, means leading with heart and never forgetting who you lead for. Beneath the grey sky of Northern California, the Eel River winds like a story too ancient to write down. Its banks are cracked in summer, swollen in winter, and always listening. The water is never still. It remembers. And for the Bear River Band, it has become more than a landmark. It is a covenant, a relative, a patient one, but not forever. There was a time when the salmon came like thunder, thousands surging upstream, the river pulsing with muscle and silver. The people called them by names long before Latin or legal codes, not just fish, but kin. Harvesting salmon wasn't a right, it was a responsibility, a gift taken with ceremony, not greed. But then the world changed. Dams went up, clear-cutting stripped the hills, sediment choked the spawning beds, chemicals ran off logging roads and cattle land, and the salmon came less each year, thinner, confused, dying before they could lay their eggs. By the end of the 20th century, the Eel River was no longer a giver of life. It had become a warning, and so the Bear River Band decided to listen. Not just with science, but with story. It started with a question. What if the old ways still had something to teach? Elders gathered with biologists at water's edge. One carried a notebook. The other carried memory. The salmon, they said, don't just follow water. They follow the shadow of trees, the rhythm of fog, the cold veins that run beneath redwood roots. Strip the land, and you blind the fish. Cut the trees, and the rivers grow, too warm. Drown the estuary in concrete, and the tide forgets how to breathe. These were not metaphors, they were instructions. So the tribe got to work. They partnered with conservation groups and academic institutions, but they led with traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, not data alone, but a way of being in the world where everything is relationship. They began replanting native vegetation along the river's edge, willows, sedges, and beargrass, the same plants their ancestors once wove into baskets and roof thatching. These roots didn't just hold soil, they held continuity. They filtered water, cooled the banks, gave shelter to juvenile salmon. Youth from the tribe joined in, not out of obligation, but out of awakening. Many had grown up hearing stories of the salmon, but had never seen a full run with their own eyes. Now they waded into the water, shovels in hand, learning the names of plants not from textbooks, but from the mouths of elders beside them. A boy named Elias, barely 15, worked in silence for most of the day, planting fire-resilient oak saplings along a slope once burned in a fast-moving blaze. When asked why he kept at it, even after blisters formed on his palms, he shrugged and said, "I think the land is just trying to remember how to be good again." That's what this work became, not just restoration, but remembering. And it wasn't limited to water. The hills around Bear River had also suffered. Decades of aggressive logging had left the slopes scarred and brittle. In fire season, the winds moved too fast and the trees too dry. The tribe began teaching controlled burns again, cultural burning, an ancient method once banned by federal policy. Now, those teachings were being brought back. Tribal fire stewards walked the land in spring, reading the underbrush like a book. They burned patches of forest slowly, carefully, with flame that fed, not consumed. The oak trees responded first. Their acorns grew thicker, the bear grass came back greener, and the animals, long displaced by human noise, began to return. Foxes, hawks, even cougar tracks traced in morning dew. None of this was spectacle, none of it televised. But for the people, it was sacred. Along the coastal ridge, a grandmother named Juna led a group of children into the fog. They weren't hiking, they were listening. She stopped beneath a cluster of wind-shaped firs and knelt, brushing aside moss to reveal a small patch of lichen-covered stone. "This was a trail marker," she whispered. "When the fog was too thick to see, we followed the cold under our feet. The ground would tell you where the path was." The children said nothing. One reached down and touched the stone, feeling its chill. Land-based education, they called it. But it was more than curriculum. It was ceremony. In a world rushing toward climate collapse, the Bear River Band had become still, not passive, but rooted. Their teachings weren't nostalgic, artifacts of a lost era. They were blueprints. Survival, in this century, meant more than adaptation. It meant relationship. And the science was catching up. Studies confirmed what the elders already knew. Rivers cooled by tree canopy brought back fish. Soil protected by native grasses absorbed floodwaters. Cultural burns reduced fire severity and restored biodiversity. But for the Bear River people, proof had never required peer review. It had lived in story, in gesture, in the ritual of tending. Even the language of the land mattered. Elias, the boy who planted oaks, began learning the word for river in Matole. It wasn't just a noun, it described emotion, a pulse, a path that turns but never breaks. Later, in a tribal gathering, he stood beside his mentor and said it aloud. The elders nodded. One whispered, "Now the river knows you too." This was what made Bear River different. Conservation wasn't charity. It wasn't an abstract mission to save the planet. It was family business. When the land suffered, they suffered. When the water healed, so did they. They told the young ones that each tree planted was a promise. Each stream unblocked was a song being taught again. The work wasn't fast, but it was forever. And in the quietest places, the land began to answer. Salmon numbers crept upward, not dramatically, not enough to declare victory, but enough to bring hope. In one stream, after decades of silence, a pair of steelhead were spotted building a redd, a nest of gravel, circular and shining. It was a whisper, but a loud one. Because the ancestors had always said, if you listen long enough, the river will speak. So the tribe keeps listening, with hands in soil, with fire used like prayer, with youth learning not just how to survive, but how to belong. The world may not see them, but the water does. The hills do. And the spirit that connects them, the old, slow breath of the land, remembers. Because at Bear River, The past is not gone. It's growing back. The Bear River Hills have always held quiet power. Wind drifting through redwood limbs, the slow curve of salmon-rich waters below, and memories layered like lichen over stone. For generations, the people who belonged to this land measured prosperity in cedar smoke, river rhythm, and the steady pulse of ancestral memory. But as the 21st century crept closer, survival asked for something else. Money. Not as a replacement for story, but as a lifeline. A way to keep the lights on in the health clinic, to send kids to college, to repair the roads that led to ceremony grounds once lost to erosion and indifference. And so, in a valley just east of where the tide breathes inland, the Bear River Casino Resort opened its doors. It began with a vote. Not everyone agreed. Council meetings grew longer, more crowded. The old wooden chairs in the tribal hall filled with voices. Some steady with hope, others trembling with unease. The proposal was simple. Build a casino on trust land near Loletta. Use the income to fund housing, education, healthcare, and cultural programs. A chance to reclaim not just recognition, but sustainability. But nothing about it felt simple. For some, the very idea of flashing lights and rows of slot machines in Bear River territory felt like betrayal. One elder stood before the room and asked, "Will we trade our baskets for poker chips? Will we sing our songs beneath neon?" For others, it was a chance long overdue. A young council member, barely 30, answered, "Our ancestors traded. They built. They adapted. Would we rather be poor and proud while our kids go hungry?" Both were right, and that's what made the decision so heavy. Still, the tribe moved forward, not without conflict, not without debate, but with intent. The land was surveyed. Environmental impact assessments were done with care. Redwoods were left untouched. The design was shaped with more timber than steel, more stone than glass. Every line drawn on blueprints came with a question behind it. What would it mean? What would it change? When the doors finally opened, there was a strange stillness at first. The casino gleamed under artificial stars. Guests arrived in cars that bore no memory of the ground they rolled over. The machines buzzed, the lights pulsed, money moved. It was, by most standards, a success. And with that money came what had long been needed. Tribal members no longer had to drive an hour to see a doctor. A medical clinic was built on tribal land, fully staffed, tribally governed, offering care with both stethoscopes and sage. The clinic didn't just treat illness, it remembered. Patients were greeted in Wiyot phrases. Ceremonial herbs were offered alongside antibiotics. It was medicine layered with memory. New homes went up on the rancheria. Stronger roofs, insulated walls, gardens with native plants. For the first time in generations, families no longer had to choose between heating their homes and feeding their children. Running water was no longer a dream. It was standard. Scholarships flowed next. Tribal youth sent to universities with tuition paid from revenue once built from ceremonial trade routes. Some studied law. Others studied natural science. A few came home to teach language. But for every milestone, a quiet tension lingered. Some elders never set foot in the casino. They didn't speak against it directly. But they walked the old trails more often. They prayed in the deeper groves. They told stories that never mentioned roulette wheels or blackjack tables, as if to hold on to something purer just a little longer. Others walked through the casino halls with dignity, wearing beaded earrings and carrying ancestral names on their tribal IDs. They worked in security, hospitality, management. They greeted guests with a welcome that was both warm and careful, as if saying, "You are here now, but this is still our house." The internal debate never truly ended, nor should it have. Some questioned how much the tribe should grow. Should expansion come with stricter cultural boundaries? Should there be quotas for where the money goes? How much should be invested in job creation versus cultural revitalization? Even architecture sparked division. One proposal suggested remodeling the lobby into something more modern. glass columns, metallic finishes. Another countered with a plan to carve redwood pillars engraved with the stories of the people of the eel. That plan was chosen because even if the world pressed inward, the Bear River Band would inscribe itself into the very walls. But the most powerful transformation wasn't physical. It was the shift in narrative. For so long, native nations were seen only as victims, conquered, forgotten, erased. But here, on a hill not far from where the smokehouses still stood, the Bear River Band flipped that story. They were no longer recipients. They were architects. Their casino wasn't just a building, it was a fulcrum, balancing history and survival, tradition and modernity. And at that fulcrum stood people who had once been deemed legally extinct. One such person was Carla. She grew up during the termination era. As a child, she slept on a dirt floor and carried water from a spring half a mile away. Now she managed the casino's business office. She still gathered acorns in the fall, still sang lullabies in Wiot to her grandchildren. Her life bridged both worlds and proved they didn't have to cancel each other out. Still, the question lingered. What is the cost of prosperity? That question echoed through every tribal meeting, every vote on expansion, every mural painted on the casino walls. And maybe the answer isn't found in a single policy or dollar figure. Maybe it's in the way the tribe continues to ask it, again and again, refusing to let comfort dull conscience. They fund basket weaving classes with casino money. They plant native gardens beside parking lots. They host storytelling nights in the tribal hall built from gaming revenue. And when visitors ask about the tribe's history, they don't hand out pamphlets. They offer stories, names, and the knowledge that everything here is earned. The Bear River Casino Resort stands now as a monument not to gambling, but to a people who refuse to be invisible, who turn the tools of the modern world into vessels of remembrance, who walk the tightrope between survival and soul, with eyes wide open and with ancestors at their side. Because survival in the 21st century looks different than it did on the old trails. But it still requires the same thing: knowing who you are, where you come from, and why you're still here. The Bear River Band knows. And the lights above the gaming floor? They don't outshine the fire burning in the smokehouse just over the ridge. Both glow, both provide, and both, in their own way, are sacred. The wind that moves through the Bear River hills today doesn't sound like the wind of 40 years ago. It carries a different cadence, one shaped by voices still young, yet old with memory. At the edge of the rancheria, near a clearing where ceremony fires once burned in secret, a group of children walks barefoot through grass still damp with early fog. Their teacher stops beneath a hawthorn tree and speaks the name for it in Wiot. A few kids stumble through the syllables. One whispers it again to herself, like a spell she doesn't quite understand, but wants to believe in. This is what survival looks like now. A generation raised not in silence, but in rediscovery. They call themselves children of the return. The ones born after restoration, after the federal government finally admitted it had been wrong to terminate the tribe. These children were not raised under the burden of legal invisibility, but they carry the weight of its scars. Their parents remember what it meant to be told your culture was obsolete. Their grandparents remember boarding schools, land loss, the silence of names unspoken. But these children, they speak. In a small tribal classroom overlooking the Van Dusen River, Wiot and Matoli words echo off painted drywall and whiteboards. The curriculum is unlike any found in a public school. Alongside math and science, students learn basketry, traditional plant harvesting, and the oral histories of their own community. They memorize the names of rivers before they were renamed on settler maps. They study the protocols of smokehouse ceremony, the architecture of redwood lodges, the migration patterns of coastal birds once used as seasonal calendars. Some of their lessons come from books, most come from elders. A woman named Ellen, nearly 80, teaches beadwork every Thursday. Her hands are knotted with arthritis, but her patterns are flawless, each line of shell and glass telling a story older than California's statehood. The kids sit close, threading beads, asking questions. Ellen doesn't lecture. She remembers. She tells them about her mother's mother, who once taught her to read the ocean fog like a language. Across the room, a teenage boy named Devon sits quietly, not beading, but drawing. His sketchpad fills with symbols, coastal ridgelines, coyote figures, cedar trees. He's part of the tribe's digital storytelling cohort, blending ancestral knowledge with modern tools. Devon and others like him are building animated short films based on Bear River legends, using software to bring old tales into a new age. One of his films, a retelling of the salmon's journey to the Eel River, recently played at a youth film festival in Sacramento. He wore a ribbon shirt and sneakers on stage. When he introduced the film, he didn't thank the judges or the sponsors. He thanked the river. Another girl, Marissa, leads a youth council made up of 12 tribal members under the age of 25. They meet monthly, discussing everything from community events to climate activism. But beneath every agenda item is the same goal: to make sure their generation doesn't forget and doesn't wait for permission to lead. Last year, the Youth Council proposed a cultural summer camp held on ancestral Bear River land. The elders approved. For 10 days, children and teens camped beneath old-growth trees, learned to start fires with bow drills, to trap fish with willow baskets, to tell time by the arc of the sun. They shared ghost stories, but they also told the truth about what was lost and what they refused to let go. A 13-year-old boy stood during the closing circle and said, "I thought we were just learning how to survive in the forest. But now I know. We're learning how to survive being Indian in the world." His words rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. The tribe's education department has grown in the past decade, not just in resources, but in vision. They fund college scholarships for tribal members pursuing everything from environmental science to film. They organize field trips to historical sites long ignored by textbooks. They've created language apps, flashcards, even social media campaigns in native dialects, turning Instagram and TikTok into tools of cultural memory. And still, the process isn't without pain. Some youth carry the trauma of disconnection. Families split by foster systems, generational poverty, substance abuse, wounds inflicted not by accident, but by centuries of policy. Reconnecting with heritage is not always a joyful return. For some, it's a confrontation. To learn the names of the plants your great-grandmother once harvested is to realize you never knew her. To speak your language is to recognize how close it came to silence. But the tribe doesn't hide from that grief. They teach through it. In one workshop, a teacher explains how basketry is not just utility, but resilience. That each coil, each stitch, is an act of patience, a protest against the fast and disposable. That the shape of a basket mirrors the shape of memory, tight at the base, wide at the rim, open to receive. The students listen. Then they begin weaving. There are no perfect lines, but there is beauty. There is intention. There is belonging. One young woman, Sarah, once wrote in her scholarship application, "I want to be a doctor, so my people never have to choose between medicine and culture again. I want my patients to feel safe bringing sage into the clinic." She's now in her second year of med school, returning home every summer to work in the tribal health center. These youth, born into an era of restoration, raised on both Wi-Fi and ceremony, are redefining what it means to inherit a culture nearly lost. They are not museum pieces. They are architects of a future built on ancestral blueprints. They argue with each other. They laugh. They paint their faces for ceremony and wear headphones on the bus. They recite old prayers into smartphones. They are contradictions. They are healing. And the elders, they watch. Some with cautious hope. Others with pride so fierce it stings behind the eyes. They remember when this kind of future was unthinkable, when their words were banned, their dances outlawed, their very existence denied. Now they see those same words inked in youth poetry, those dances posted online for thousands to witness, that existence thriving. At the edge of the forest, where ceremony fires will burn again this winter, a young girl kneels to tie her moccasin. Her hands are small, her eyes are focused. She is humming a tune no one taught her in school, a tune passed down in smoke and story. She is not the end of the line, she is its continuation. And the torch she carries is not one of flame alone, but of memory lit anew. The land still speaks, but now it speaks in smoke. In the hills above the Bear River Valley, the trees no longer whisper only stories, they scream when they burn. The soil that once held roots in ceremony now cracks under drought. The river, once the lifeblood of a people, runs thinner with each passing year, choked by sediment, by heat, by upstream neglect. The Bear River Band has survived conquest, silence, and termination. But the threats they face now don't wear uniforms or carry rifles. They come in waves of heat, in winds that twist into firestorms, in policies written in boardrooms far from the forest floor. And still, the tribe remains, not untouched, but unbroken. The summer of 2021 tested that resolve. Lightning struck high in the King Range. Within hours, flame galloped through dry brush and timber, fueled by decades of mismanagement and climate extremes. Smoke painted the sky the color of old blood. Ash fell like snow across the rancheria. Tribal members scrambled to evacuate, elders first, then families with small children. One woman clutched a cedar basket to her chest as she ran. Inside were beadwork tools, clippings of sage, and a folded piece of paper. Her grandmother's funeral song, written in shaky Matole script. The fire line crept close to the smokehouse. Volunteers formed a wall, armed with shovels, blankets, and garden hoses. They stayed until the last ember was drowned. No one slept. Afterward, the land smoldered. Oak groves were blackened, trails were gone, animals fled. And yet, when the ash cooled, the people returned. Not to mourn, to replant, to protect. This wasn't the first fire. It wouldn't be the last, but it wasn't the only threat. In recent years, development pressure has increased across Humboldt County. New roads, new zoning proposals, agricultural expansion, water diversion plans. Each project pitched with promises of progress, jobs, economic growth. For the Bear River Band, these words come with a price. Too often, they translate to displacement, to pollution, to the silencing of rivers that once sang with salmon. In 2019, a commercial development plan proposed rerouting runoff through a sacred wetland, a place where elders still gather medicine plants, where stories say a child once met her spirit guide. The project was greenlit by local officials without tribal consultation. The tribe responded swiftly, not with weapons, but with resolve. Legal petitions were filed, letters sent. Elders stood at the edge of the wetland holding photos of their ancestors. Youth held signs not written in protest slogans, but in language older than the country itself. One girl stood barefoot in the marsh and said, "If you drain this place, you drain our memory." The project stalled, not cancelled, but delayed, a small victory carved from bureaucracy. And behind the scenes, lawyers prepared for a longer fight. These struggles are not romantic, they are exhausting. Meetings stretch for hours, funding is tight, opponents are powerful. Yet every battle reaffirms something sacred. That sovereignty means protecting more than land. It means protecting relationship, to water, to fire, to those yet to be born. Drought is another enemy. The river levels drop, the fish struggle to spawn, the wells run slow. In response, the Bear River environmental team dug deeper, literally and figuratively. Old knowledge met new methods. Groundwater was monitored, grey water systems tested, rain catchments installed, and prayers offered. Because for this tribe, Science isn't separate from spirit. It walks beside it. In the driest season, tribal youth organized a fog harvesting experiment, setting up nets high in the ridgeline to capture moisture from the morning mist. It worked. A few gallons a day, enough to water native seedlings, enough to believe, because belief matters here. One elder, William, whose face carries the deep etchings of smoke and sun, once said, "We outlived the ones who called us extinct. We'll outlive the heat too." He sits at every council meeting now with a walking stick carved from driftwood, watching, listening. Not to speak often, but to remind others that endurance is not about strength. It's about patience, that patience is tested constantly. In 2022, a lawsuit was filed against a regional company responsible for contaminating a tributary that fed into Bear River fishing grounds. For months, nothing was done. Then came the denials, the delays, the paperwork piled like winter snow. But the tribe didn't back down. They collected water samples, recorded fish die-offs, brought the evidence to court. And slowly, change began. Not because the system wanted it, but because the Bear River people refused to vanish. Protest is no longer always about standing in the road. Sometimes it's sitting across from someone in a suit, reminding them that the tree they call timber value once fed your family, healed your sick, and held your dead. The Bear River Band teaches its youth this truth early. In the tribal school, children learn about fire regimes, watershed cycles, zoning, laws, but also about listening to birds, reading wind patterns, understanding that fire is not enemy, but relative, misunderstood, misused, but sacred. Cultural camps now include emergency drills. Basket weaving classes are paired with first aid. Songs are sung not just to call ancestors, but to calm children during evacuation alerts. It is a new kind of bushcraft, a modern survival, born not in wild isolation, but in the chaos of overlapping worlds. The land no longer threatens with hunger or frost, but with negligence, with greed, with the blunt force of a changing planet. And still, the Bear River Band endures, not because they are untouched, but because they are rooted in fog and fire, in blood and bone, in treaties broken and promises reclaimed. They plant native gardens in scorched soil. They chant near rivers choked by drought. They build solar arrays beside smokehouses. They vote. They protest. They teach. Not just to survive, but to remain themselves. Because resilience is not just returning to who you were. It's becoming who you were always meant to be, even when the world tries to pull you apart. The fires will come again. The water will rise and fall. But when it does, the Bear River Band will be there, standing in the smoke, listening to the land, ready once more to begin again. And in that beginning, there will be no retreat, only a vow to endure, to defend, to belong. The wind moves low across the water now, soft, patient, as if it has nothing left to prove. The Bear River does not rush. It folds around stones that remember footsteps no longer heard. It gathers the light of the morning sky, reflects the drift of birds overhead, and carries the voices of those who once knelt at its edge to drink, to cleanse, to sing. It is here, after everything, that they return. A ceremonial walk winds down from the high ridge, the path narrow, flanked by tall grass and low shrubs glistening with dew. There are no cameras, no microphones, just the quiet breath of the land and the rhythmic pulse of a drum carried between two elders, its beats slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat rediscovered. Children lead the procession, their hair braided, eyes wide. Some carry baskets, others hold feathers. Behind them walk the parents, the teachers, the council members, and at the rear, not as afterthoughts but as anchors, the elders, those whose hands once shaped these hills in silence, those who remember when the river was feared lost. A woman named Clara walks with them. Her back is bent now, her steps small, but her voice, when she sings the old river song, cuts clear through the morning air. She learned it as a girl, hiding beneath a table, while her grandmother hummed it over a simmering pot of acorn mush. It was a song not meant to be heard by outsiders, not after what had been done, but today it rises freely, not as protest, not as spectacle, but as prayer. The river bends ahead, a gentle curve where the water slows and deepens. It is the place where the salmon used to rest before the last stretch upstream. The elders say that in the old times, the water here was so thick with fish you could walk across on their backs, that each salmon carried a story, and if you listened closely as you harvested, you could hear the names of those yet to be born. It is quiet now. No salmon break the surface. But the people gather anyway. They lay offerings at the edge. Shell beads, strips of bark, a carved paddle passed down for 4 generations. They stand in silence, letting the memory of the place fill the space where grief has long lingered. And then the stories begin, not shouted, not recited, but shared, like coals passed from one hand to the next. An elder steps forward, holding a staff carved from driftwood found after the last flood. He speaks not of government or conquest, not of policies or protests. He speaks of wind, of how the wind carried the voices of the first people across the hills, how it taught the trees when to shed their bark, how it warned the animals before the storms. He says the wind is not just air, it is the breath of those who never left. It moves through us, it remembers us. Then another speaks. She tells of a time when the river flooded without warning, when a boy was swept downstream and the people thought him lost. But he returned, weeks later, walking out of the fog with fish in his hands and a song in his throat. She says the river raised him, taught him its path, and sent him back, changed. Each story spills into the next, not as chapters, but as currents, distinct, but always moving towards something greater. And still the drum beats. The fire, small but steady, is lit at the riverbank now. Smoke curls upward, blending with the mist. Children are invited forward to offer their own words, not forced, not scripted, just invited. One girl, maybe 12, steps close and places her hand on the earth. She says, "I never met my grandfather, but I think he knew this place." Her words fall gently, and behind her, an elder closes her eyes and nods. A boy steps forward next. His ribbon shirt is too big, his voice just a whisper. "I dreamt of salmon," he says. "They weren't afraid." No one speaks for a while after that. They don't need to, because this moment, is not about answers. It's about being, about gathering where the river still curves, where the ground still breathes, where the name Bear River means more than a dot on a map. It means return, not to what was, that's gone. The old village sites are buried beneath soil and barbed wire. The old trails run beneath highways now. The ancestors are not coming back, but their songs are. And so too are their people. From the smokehouse to the council chamber, from the schoolhouse to the fire line, the Bear River Band has risen not through conquest, but through connection. Their strength is not in monuments or museums, but in continuity, in knowing that the same hands planting acorns today once held bone tools in the same soil. They know that fire is not always destruction, that water is not just a boundary, but a mirror, and that stories, if carried, never die. As the ceremony winds down, the people place their hands on each other's shoulders. No formal signal is given, just a sense, shared between them, that it's time. Clara begins the final song. It is not loud, but it carries. The drum slows, the wind picks up. A hawk circles above the river, its cry sharp, then gone. And then silence, not absence, but fullness. The fire dies to embers. The river moves on. Later that night, back at the rancheria, the children will sleep with cedar tucked under their pillows. The elders will sip warm tea and remember faces no longer seen. The council will meet in the morning to discuss zoning ordinances and cultural programs. Life will go on, with all its tension, beauty, and unrelenting pace. But here, by this bend in the river, something eternal has been touched. The Bear River remembers, not just the blood, not just the fire, but the breath, the names, the promise. This is not the end of the story. It is the place where memory becomes legacy, where what was stolen is reimagined, where what was broken is carried, and where, if you are quiet, if you listen long enough, the river will speak again.
Before fences carved scars into the land, before treaties were broken, and steel rails split the horizon, there was only the wind, the endless grass, and the thunder of hooves. The northern plains, what we now call northeastern Montana, stretched like an ocean of earth, rolling out toward the horizon with no end in sight. This was a land without straight lines, without roads, without borders. A land where survival wasn't a struggle against nature, but a harmony with it, the Assiniboine. And Sioux knew this place not as wilderness, but as home. And they followed the one true path that mattered, the one carved by the buffalo for centuries. Perhaps millennia, the buffalo led. They dictated the rhythms of life. When to move, when to camp, when to hunt, when to prey. The great herds could be heard before they were seen, a low rumble on the wind, like distant thunder rolling across the plains. Tens of thousands of beasts, each one weighing nearly a ton, moved like a living tide. Their hooves churned the prairie into soil. Their hides would one day shield a child from winter. Their bones would become tools, their flesh survival too. Follow them was not just a matter of food, it was spiritual. The Assiniboine, a people once known as the Nakota, and the Sioux, the Dakota and Lakota, understood that their survival was not guaranteed by dominance, but by respect. They spoke of the buffalo in stories passed from lodge to lodge, elder to child. They believed the buffalo had given themselves freely, if taken with honor, if taken without greed. Each season had its rhythm. In spring, as the thaw wakened the land, the tribes moved slowly, gathering roots, tending to horses, waiting for the calving of the buffalo. Summer brought the large communal hunt ceremonies, in themselves where the entire community played a role. Scouts rode out days in advance, scanning the horizon. Men prepared their arrows. Bowstrings waxed with animal fat. Women prepared the drying racks, the hide stretchers, and the marrow stones. Children watched, learning without being told. And when the hunt began, it was not a reckless stampede, it was an art. Riders would flank the herd, their horses trained to move as one. The best hunters knew how to guide, not panic, the beasts. A clean kill was a mark of respect. A wounded animal meant waste. Waste meant dishonor. The arrival of horses in the 18th century brought north through Spanish trade routes changed everything. Suddenly, the range widened. Hunts grew larger. Battles between neighboring tribes for control of hunting grounds became fiercer. But it was also the age of diplomacy. The Assiniboine, known for their skill as intermediaries and traders, forged alliances with distant peoples. The Sioux, already fierce warriors, became masters of mounted warfare. These alliances and rivalries would shape every decision to come to understand this world. One must abandon the idea of land ownership. The Assiniboine did not draw lines in the soil. The Sioux did not mark maps with ink. They moved like water across the land, setting up camps near rivers, under the shadow of buttes. By sacred springs known only to their elders, a single lodge might rise where a buffalo once fell. A campsite might form where a vision quest had been held years before. These were not coincidences. These were echoes, places where the land spoke, and the people listened. And in this way, identity was not forged by fixed address, but by memory, by trail, by kinship. Kinship governed everything. A man did not act for himself, he acted for the Tierspe, the extended family unit, one's duty to cousins, elders, children, and in-laws shaped daily choices. There were no strangers in a healthy camp, only those whose stories you hadn't heard yet. Women held immense influence, not only within the family, but in council. Elders were revered not as fragile remnants of the past, but as living libraries. And, above it all, the buffalo, Tatanka. Their presence was a covenant. If the herds flourished, the people flourished. If they disappeared, so would the people. By the early 1800s, the balance still held, though just barely. The pressure of colonial encroachment had yet to arrive in full force, but whispers had begun to ripple through the camps, for traders moved west, bringing blankets and beads, but also disease and debt. Forts rose along rivers first as trade outposts, then as symbols of permanence. And with each passing season, more land was claimed by names the people could not pronounce. Still, in the valleys of the Milk River and the wide-open reaches of what would one day be called Fort Peck, the old ways endured. Smoke rose from lodges. In the early dawn, tools carved from flint and bone still served as lifelines. Children still learned the stars and the songs, and elders still remembered the time before horses when dogs pulled travois. And migration was slower, but no less sacred. Even the tools of daily survival bear history. Knives passed down for 3 generations. Elk-hide shields painted with dreams seen during vision quests. Flint scrapers were used by grandmothers to clean hides. While telling stories of when the stars came closer to the earth, these weren't objects. They were memories etched into matter. In the quiet moments between hunts, there was ceremony, the sun dance, the sweat lodge, the story circle. Songs sung not for entertainment, but for instruction, for connection, for healing, because survival on the plains was not just about food or shelter, it was about balance. Between hunger and gratitude, between warrior and healer, between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. In this first chapter, we do not yet find tragedy, but we feel the winds beginning to shift. A trader's wagon creaks across the prairie, carrying rifles where there once were bows. A child sees white men for the first time and wonders if the spirits have changed. A warrior sharpens his lance, not for buffalo, but for something else, something unnamed. Coming from the east. And yet for now the buffalo still lead. Their breath still mists in the early morning cold. Their hooves still churn the grasslands into life. Their eyes still meet those of the hunter, and in that gaze, an unspoken pact is renewed. This was the world the Assiniboine and Sioux were born into. Not a world of dominance, not a world of conquest, but a world of rhythm, of survival, of trust between land, beast, and kin, a world that would soon be tested in ways no one could have foreseen. But before treaties, before railroads, before reservation borders would confine what once ran wild, there was only the wind, the song of the drum, and the endless trail of the buffalo. And so we begin where the buffalo led, where survival was not a struggle against nature, but a communion with it, where every step, every campfire, every hunt carried the memory of those who walked before, and where the heart of a people beat in time with the hooves of 1,000 buffalo, cresting the horizon at dawn. The year was 1837. The wind over the Missouri carried more than the scent of rain. That summer, it carried something silent, invisible, something that didn't belong to the land or its people. It came upriver tucked in the belly of a steamboat. The St. Peter's, a floating marvel of iron and steam, moved swiftly through the waters like a serpent. Aboard it, trade goods from the east, wool blankets, powder, beads, were folded deep among the cargo, sewn tightly in warmth meant for barter. Hid a death sentence. Smallpox. There were no warning signs in the beginning, no omens in the sky, just swollen eyes, fevers, shivering bodies too weak to rise from bedrolls. Then came the sore's angry red blisters that bloomed like wildfire across faces, arms, and bellies. The sick were contagious before the first scab broke, and by then it was already too late. It started near Fort Union, a distant outpost of commerce, where Assiniboine, Hidatsa, Mandan, and Sioux came to trade. When the sickness broke out, it spread not like a ripple, but like a flood. From one trader to one lodge, from one camp to 5, from the Missouri Basin to the high plains. It swept across villages like fire through dry grass, leaving silence where songs once rose. Some elders said it was the breath of the spirits angry at the white man's greed. Others whispered that the blankets had been cursed. A handful claimed it was deliberate, that traders had knowingly passed the infected wares. There was no agreement, only grief and death. Within a matter of weeks, entire bands began to vanish. Among the Assiniboine, the sickness struck hardest in early summer. Traders recorded, in terse handwriting, the decimation of camps. One noted, out of a group of 400 souls, perhaps 50 yet live. But paper could not capture what was felt in those days, the wails of mothers burning the bodies of their children, the sight of warriors, strong and proud, collapsing beside the large poles they once carried with ease. One account from an Assiniboine woman preserved, through oral history, tells of how her entire tearspa was taken in for days. The sun rose, she said, and I was the only one breathing. Even the dogs had died. The Sioux suffered no less. The Oglala, the Yanktonai, the Hunkpapa each mourned chiefs, medicine men, women of wisdom, elders who held the songs of the people, visionaries who had once guided war parties now laid cold in open grass, unburied, untouched for fear of spreading the blight. And in the face of so much loss, the grief was not only for the body but for the soul, because when an elder died, so too did their stories, their knowledge of sacred herbs, the meaning behind star maps, the names of ancestors. In one generation, Entire centuries of memory risked being extinguished. But even then, even in the deepest night of despair, the people did not vanish. Some turned to ceremony not in grand gatherings, for fear of spreading the sickness, but in whispered songs sung alone beside dying fires. Small was quieter than that, yet no less powerful. A gathering, a murmur, the slow rise of something that had nearly been lost. Self-determination. The Indian Reorganization Act had passed in June of that year, a sweeping piece of federal legislation born from the ashes of failed policies: the Dawes Act, the boarding schools, the allotment system that had splintered lands and broken families. Now, Washington promised something different: the right to govern, to reorganize, to shape tribal futures, not in the image of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but in the voice of the people themselves. At Fort Peck, the offer arrived in the form of paperwork thick, officious, and laced with legalese. But for the elders who gathered beneath canvas tents and on agency porches, the questions were anything but abstract. Could this be trusted? Would self-rule be real or just another illusion? Voices rose around council fires, in log cabins, and over the rhythmic clatter of looms and branding irons. The community debated not only the details of a constitution, but what it meant to reclaim a system of leadership stripped away generations ago. Some saw opportunity. Thomas Red Fox, a rancher and World War I veteran, stood before a crowd near Poplar and declared, "We've ridden too long with another man's saddle. Maybe now we make one of our own." Others were more cautious. Esther White Eagle, a language teacher and former boarding school student, asked, "How do we lead with the tongue they punished us for speaking?" There were no easy answers. The IRA offered tribal nations a path to elect their own governments, to form corporations, to write their own constitutions. But it also came with strings: federal oversight, templates drafted in D.C., and the looming presence of the beer in nearly every decision. Still, the people of Fort Peck voted, and by a narrow margin, they chose to reorganize. It was the beginning of something fragile, but historic. Local leaders began drafting a constitution not from books or precedents, but from memory, from tradition, from the echo of councils that once met under stars instead of ceilings. They debated how to balance Assiniboine and Sioux representation, how to elect leaders without erasing hereditary voices, how to structure courts that could honor both federal law and tribal custom. Meetings stretched late into the night. Arguments flared, cooled, reignited. Some elders demanded greater spiritual protections in the new government. Younger men insisted on economic development clauses. Women, long the keepers of tradition, pushed for a say in decision-making despite federal templates that largely ignored them. In time, a council was formed. Elections were held not without tension, but with pride. James Standing Rock Grabier was elected as the first tribal chairman under the new system. A soft-spoken man who had once ridden dispatch for the U.S. cavalry and later returned home to raise sheep. He carried both worlds in his bones. His first speech was not in English. It was in Nakota. "We are not copies," he said. "We are the continuation. Let them write that in their ledgers." The new government faced a steep path. The agency still controlled major resources leases, permits, land claims. The tribal council had to negotiate constantly for access to federal funds, to clarify jurisdiction, to be heard. But each meeting, each policy passed, was a step back toward a kind of sovereignty that had once seemed impossible. They started small. Road repairs, livestock programs, education subsidies. The formation of a tribal court, though limited in scope, offered an alternative to distant judges who didn't know the difference between Nakota and Dakota, between a medicine bundle and contraband. Then came larger strides. A tribal business council was created to manage resources and reinvest earnings into the community. Housing projects were launched small at first, built by hand with salvaged timber and sweat equity. But they represented something no outside agency could deliver: shelter with dignity. And slowly, a new generation was raised seeing tribal leaders in suits and feathers, holding gavel and pipe, walking into Washington meetings not as guests but as equals, at least in principle. Grassroots democracy, however, was never smooth. Disagreements arose between families, between tribal factions, between the Assiniboine and Sioux, whose differences sometimes flared even as they stood on shared ground. Debates over land use, education, and oil leases brought both division and dialogue. But unlike the distant governments of past centuries, this one could be spoken to in the community's own voice. One striking example came in 1942, when the tribal council rejected a proposed dam project that would have flooded sacred sites along the Missouri River. The Bureau had approved the plan, citing economic gain. But the elders, led by Councilwoman Nora Firecloud, stood their ground. "You measure water by acre-feet," she said. "We measure it by ancestors. Our answer is no." The dam was delayed, modified, ultimately rerouted. It was a small victory, but a powerful one. By the 1950s, Fort Peck's tribal government was not just a formality, it was a force. New generations ran for office. Language programs were launched. A tribal newspaper emerged, printed on old linotype machines. Its headlines in bold read, "Fort Peck will decide its own future." That promise was tested again and again. Federal policies shifted. Termination loomed. Urban relocation drained population. But the political foundation laid during the Indian reorganization era held firm, because it was built not by bureaucrats, but by people who had survived too much to surrender now. People like Esther White Eagle, who later chaired the Education Committee and fought to reintroduce tribal history into Fort Peck schools. People like James Graybeer, who retired with the quote still carved on the back of his office door: "Not copies, continuation." And people whose names were never written down, but who showed up to every meeting, cast every ballot, asked every hard question, knowing that democracy is not a gift, but a grind. Today, Fort Peck's tribal government continues to evolve, with broadband policy meetings and constitutional amendments, with Zoom conferences and smudge ceremonies, with the same balance of tradition and adaptation that has defined their survival since the buffalo roamed thick across the plains. And when The council meets beneath fluorescent lights instead of open sky. The echoes of those early voices still hum in the room. You can almost hear them if you listen close, the murmur of a people no longer waiting to be saved, but choosing, instead, to lead. By the time the 20th century began to slip into the 21st, many outside voices had already written the final chapters of Fort Peck's story. They said the buffalo were gone, that the language would vanish with the elders, that ceremony had been buried beneath concrete and bureaucracy, that the reservation would shrink into silence. But Fort Peck had never agreed to those endings. What rose instead slowly, defiantly, was not silence, but song. It began in whispers. In the early 1980s. A grandmother named Clara Red Elk sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by cassette tapes, notebooks, and worn-out dictionaries. Her fingers, stiff from years of beadwork, traced the lines of Nakota syllables long written only in memory. She wasn't a linguist. She was a survivor. And she was teaching her grandson to really speak what she called the language of bones. They tried to burn it out of me at school, she said, so now I teach it before I forget. That grandson, Jeremy, would grow up to launch Fort Peck's first full-time language immersion program, held not in a classroom, but in a tippy circle beneath the open sky. Children sat cross-legged beside elders, repeating words for wind, fire, buffalo. They learned not just how to talk, but how to listen. Because the words carried more than meaning, they carried the land. By the late 1990s, Land 2 was returning, though not without a fight. Fort Peck's tribal council began buying back parcels once lost through allotment and inheritance fractionation. Each deed reclaimed was a heartbeat restored. But it wasn't just paper, it was purpose. On the northern edge of the reservation, fences came down. Bulldozers cleared invasive brush. Water holes were repaired. And then, after nearly a century, they came back. The buffalo. Not the same herds that once darkened the plains, but descendants, wild, watchful, sent by other tribes, conservationists, and elders who remembered a time when the ground shook with their hooves. When the first herd was released onto Fort Peck land, a ceremony was held. No cameras, no press, just song, sage, and silence. Elders cried. Children laughed. One boy, no more than 7, stood beside his father and whispered, "They came back because we called them." And he wasn't wrong, because all across Fort Peck, the call to remember had become the call to rebuild. Sweat lodges, once conducted in secret, now steamed openly beside schools. Sun dances returned to the prairie, their drums echoing across coulees and ravines like thunder that had waited too long to speak. Ceremonial pipes passed from hand to hand, not behind closed doors, but under full moons, with heads bowed in gratitude, not shame. It wasn't always easy. The memories of boarding schools still clung to too many family trees. Generations raised to feel shame about ceremony, about long hair, about native names, still wrestled with internal wars. One elder, William to Stars Runs Above, spoke of it during a community gathering. They told me to kneel for the flag and never rise for my own prayers. I did, for years, until one day, My grandson asked me what his spirit name was, and I couldn't remember mine. That was the day I began to sing again. From those quiet returns came louder movements. Powwows once held in dusty gymnasiums now drew dancers from across the country. Regalia, once stored in trunks, came alive in swirls of color elk teeth, quills, eagle feathers. Beadwork that spoke in patterns older than written language. Drums pounded in circles that didn't just echo celebration, but survival. And from the youth came fire. Cultural camps sprang up on riverbanks and beneath pine groves. Teens who had grown up on video games and fast food now learned how to tan hides, build sweat lodges, and harvest medicines from the land. They watched elders flake obsidian, stir berry soups over open flame, and sing lullabies in tongues the government once labeled savage. They listened, they asked questions, and they recorded everything. With phones, with journals, with memory, because they knew the silence had lasted too long and their time had come to be louder. One camp, the young wolves became a proving ground not for warriors of war, but warriors of culture. Youth competed not in running or shooting, but in storytelling, language games, and drum contests. The prize was honor. The reward was identity. Even the schools began to shift. By 2010. Fort Peck's education system included culture credits, language electives, and elders in residence programs. School announcements were read in English and Dakota. Graduation ceremonies opened with smudging, and tribal history, once relegated to a page in a federal textbook, now filled entire semesters. But this was not nostalgia. It was resistance. Because Fort Peck knew that cultural loss is not just about forgetting, it's about being made to forget, about generations stripped of ceremony, displaced from land, broken apart by courts and cattle and churches and classrooms. So every word spoken in Nakota, every buffalo calf born on tribal soil, every drumbeat that rose during a moonlit powwow. It all said the same thing. We're still here, and we are not fading. In 2017, Fort Peck hosted the Gathering of Nations Cultural Summit, an unprecedented collaboration between tribal elders, youth, historians, and leaders from across the plains. For 3 days, the sound of lectures, laughter, singing, and healing filled the valley. Dancers in full regalia stood beside tribal attorneys. Children painted with clay while tribal land managers discussed climate change and restoration. In one panel, titled Speaking the Future, high school senior Leela Charging Crane addressed over 100 people. Her voice trembled, but her eyes never left the horizon. My great-grandmother died speaking English because they told her she had to. I will die speaking Nakota because I choose to. The room went silent, then erupted, and still. Outside, the wind moved through the grass the way it always had, whispering prayers, stirring songs, carrying memories. Not of tragedy, but of return, because Fort Peck's story was never about disappearance. It was about distance, about how far a people had been pushed from their own reflection. And now, slowly, they were walking back. One song, one hoofbeat, one child at a time. The language was not dead. It had just been waiting. The land was not empty. It had just been quiet, and the legacy, like the wind, was always there just beneath the surface, ready to rise again. Morning comes slowly over the Fort Peck Reservation, not in silence but in rhythm, the sound of boots crunching frost on prairie grass, the distant echo of horses snorting against reins, a drumbeat rising from a community center, not for ceremony, but for practice, a grandmother's voice whispering. Dakota to a child bent over a tablet. In this land, history isn't just a backdrop. It's a living presence woven into the breath of those who wake each day and refuse to vanish. Fort Peck today is not free from struggle. The scars run deep: poverty, addiction, housing shortages, broken systems inherited from a century of neglect and forced dependency. Unemployment still lingers like a harsh winter wind, biting into households where heat is precious and choices are few. But to stop the story there would be to miss the point, because in every challenge there is also motion. Motion towards something stronger, something self-determined. In Poplar, the heart of the reservation, the Fort Peck Tribal College stands as a symbol of that motion. The building itself may not look grand: concrete walls, simple signage, but what happens inside is nothing short of revolutionary. Students sit around laptops, some wearing ribbon skirts, others baseball caps, all carrying stories far heavier than textbooks. They study law, environmental science, tribal governance. They learn not to erase the past but to use it. One professor, a former oil field worker named Mason Tall Bear, opens his indigenous sovereignty class with the same words each semester. They tried to bury us in policies. Now we plant roots in them. That education powers more than degrees. It fuels action. Take the Fort Peck Energy Cooperative, one of the first of its kind in Montana, born from the vision of tribal leaders who knew dependence on outside power grids was never just about electricity, it was about control. So they fought for funding, partnered with green tech engineers, and began installing solar panels across homes and schools. Now, on clear days, the sun itself helps power language labs, health clinics, and elder housing units, and each panel carries a quiet defiance. We don't just survive, we innovate. The legal fight continues. In 2016, the proposed path of the Dakota Access Pipeline drew tribal nations from across the country into protest. Fort Peck stood among them, not with weapons, but with treaties. The council sent legal teams. Youth drove overnight caravans to support Standing Rock. And back home, banners went up a long highway to "Water is life. Sovereignty is not optional." It wasn't just about oil. It was about history repeating itself again and the refusal to be silent. Fort Peck has taken its fight to the courts many times since, to secure land leases, to defend jurisdiction, to protect children from being removed under state welfare systems that often ignored tribal protections. Some battles were lost, but others weren't. And in every courthouse, every hearing room, Fort Peck elders walked in not as relics, but as witnesses. Their stories, their voices once erased from the records, now form the spine of tribal defense. At the same time, a quieter revolution hums through the homes and halls of Fort Peck. Language programs, now digitized and accessible by smartphone, allow parents to teach their children Nakota at bedtime. Ceremonial songs are archived in community databases, and tribal historians record oral testimonies from the oldest members, ensuring no story dies. With its last speaker in one elder's living room, a young girl sits with headphones, mouthing the words to a lullaby once banned by the boarding schools her great-grandmother survived. The elder watches her with tired eyes, then joins in softly, but sure. It is not perfect. Progress never is. Meth has crept into too many homes. Foster care systems struggle under the weight of generational trauma. Winters are still brutal, and funding never stretches far enough. But here, on this land, survival itself is sacred. And survival, when shared, is strength. Every July, the Watapana celebration brings thousands from across Indian country. Dancers gather in full regalia. Grandmothers sell fry bread beside horses tied to shade poles. And the scent of sage hangs thick in the summer air. Veterans in eagle feather bonnets stand beside teenagers in basketball jerseys. Elders smile. Drums thunder. It's not a performance. It's a declaration. One that says, we remember everything. And we are still dancing. At the edge of a field, a line of youth prepares for the annual Fort Peck Unity Ride. A 100-mile horseback journey retracing the trails of ancestral migration. Some ride bareback. Others wear reflective vests, but all carry the same purpose: to feel the land beneath them, to reconnect with the stories that still pulse in its soil. One boy, no more than 15, grips his reins and looks to the horizon. My grandma says the land hears you if you move slow enough. And so they ride across plains that once held villages, herds, heartbreak, and hope. Because Fort Peck is not frozen in the past. It is moving forward, fierce, alive, and it is shaped by people like Sandra Little Moon, who teaches beadwork at the community center. She doesn't take roll, she doesn't give grades. But every child who walks through the door learns more than art. They learn patience, precision, pride. Each stitch is a word, she says. Each pattern is a story. You're wearing your people when you wear this. Or Levi High Elk, who started a tech initiative teaching middle schoolers to build websites in both English and Nakota, merging tradition and innovation like threads in a braid. Or Councilwoman Janice Walking Iron, who fought for new health funding during the pandemic and helped establish one of the most efficient tribal-run vaccine programs in the region. Their names may never fill history books, but they are writing history every day. Because Fort Peck was never a relic, it is a resistance, a renaissance, a home. And as the sun sets behind the Badlands, casting long shadows over the Missouri River, the land remembers. So do the people. And they speak not in grief, but in grit, not in endings, but in continuance. A child's laughter echoes through a language once outlawed. A drumbeat rises beside a classroom projector. A buffalo calf kicks up snow near a solar panel. And a grandmother smiles, whispering, "We are still here." Bundles of sage were burned. Visions were sought. A few medicine men who had survived the pox spoke of dreams, where the spirits promised that even now The people were being tested, not punished. One of them, a Lakota named Red Clay, Robe, gathered the remaining healthy youth in his camp. He told them stories every night, not from joy but from urgency. "You must remember," he said, "when I go. Who else will say the names of the rivers? Who will know where the buffalo go to die?" And the youth listened. They listened with the intensity of those who understood they were not just survivors, but vessels, living containers of a memory older than iron. It is said that in one Assiniboine camp, only 3 people survived: a girl, her younger brother, and an old man who had gone blind the year before. For days, the girl scavenged what food she could, the corpses of her relatives too numerous to bury. When she finally found the strength to leave, she took with her only one thing: a small rawhide pouch that held her grandmother's sacred herbs. She would one day teach her own grandchildren how to use them. The land, once dotted with camps and smoke from dozens of lodges, fell quiet. Birds returned to find no songs rising from below. Even the buffalo skirted some of the old sites, as if they, too, could feel the absence. Historians today estimate that nearly 90% of some bands were wiped out, 9 out of 10. But numbers do not grieve. Numbers do not carry the weight of seeing your mother's face disfigured beyond recognition, of holding your child as their breath rattles and slows, of setting fire to your own lodge to cleanse the death within it. And yet, not all was lost. Among the survivors were children marked by the scars of the pox, their faces forever changed, but their spirits unbroken. These children would grow into adults who carried forward the traditions with a reverence that only loss can bring. Songs were rebuilt, ceremonies restored, languages preserved in pockets, whispered between generations like fragile embers passed between cupped hands. Among the Sioux, a new generation of war leaders emerged, those who had survived the blight now tempered by sorrow, hardened by fate. They remembered the silence, and they vowed not to let their people vanish in it again. Some who had once held peaceful relations with fur traders turned cold and cautious. The sickness had not come with warning, and so all alliances became suspect. Trust, once fractured, would take years to rebuild. There are stories still told today among both the Assiniboine and Sioux families of the year of the Great Silence, and in those stories, there is a dual legacy, one of devastation and one of endurance. In the shadow of smallpox, something unexpected took root, a fierce and sacred obligation to remember. To remember not only who was lost but who they were, what they sang, what they carried, and to rebuild not exactly what was but what could still be. If you walk the land today, if you stand on the ridges above the Milk River or the banks of the Missouri near old Fort Union, you will find no grave markers for the thousands lost, no headstones, no monuments. But listen. In the wind, there are names. In the bending grass, the trace of footsteps. And in the hearts of those who descend from the survivors, there is still that ember, that fire that would not die. That memory that could not be erased. This was the blight that came not with blade or bullet, but with breath, with blankets, with deceit. And yet the people remained, scarred, but not broken, diminished in number. but not in spirit. They had faced an enemy they could not fight, with bow or lance, and they had survived. For a people who once moved with the buffalo, this was the first taste of what it meant to lose not from hunger or battle, but from the weight of invisible sickness. It was a turning point, a wound in time, and still, the songs rose again. It didn't come with drums. It didn't come with hooves or thunder or rifles. It came on a boat, wrapped in wool, hidden in warmth. The St. Peter's steamboat rolled up the Missouri River in the summer of 1837, its hull stuffed with trade goods, tobacco, beads, and infected blankets. In the ledger books of the American Fur Company, this was just another shipment. But to the people who waited along the banks, the Assiniboine, the Sioux, the Mandan, the Haudotze was something else. It was death in cloth. Smallpox had visited the plains before. It came in waves in 1780, again in 1801, but this time was different. This time it came faster, hungrier. No medicine man, no vision, no prayer had foreseen it moving like this. In some villages, the first sign was fever, then chills. The elders said the eyes burned first, then the throat. A boy might wake with only a sore head and go to sleep forever before sunset. Blisters rose like boils on skin hot. Weeping, cracked open by sweat and screaming. And once the pustules came, it meant the others would follow. Every mother, every brother, every friend. And there were no warriors to fight it. At Fort Union, where tribes gathered to trade, the sickness struck first. Some say the traders didn't know what they were carrying. Others say they knew, and that the blankets were not just contaminated, but cursed. Whether by negligence or cruelty, the outcome was the same. The camps fell quiet within days. One witness, a young French Cree interpreter named Henry Dupuy, recorded what he saw in a letter to his wife. It is as though the wind itself carries it. Fires go out, and no one stirs. The dogs eat what the people cannot bury. Entire Space extended family bands died within a week. The sickness moved so fast there were no burials, no farewells. Bodies lay in the grass beside cold fires. Infants cried beside mothers who would never rise again. Lodges, once filled with laughter and song, now groaned under the weight of mourning. Among the Assiniboine, one elder remembered losing 30 relatives in 7 days. Another, a woman named Kanji Easton, or Falling Crow, told her grandchildren the story of watching her father once. A proud war chief scratching his arms raw as the pustules drove him mad. I held his head when he died, she said, and there was no one left to dig his grave. The Mandan, a tribe known for their agricultural prowess and earth lodges, were nearly annihilated. Of a population estimated at over 1,600 before the epidemic, fewer than 125 survived. George Catlin, an American painter who had visited their villages only years earlier, would later write, "The Mandan are no more. What I saw, I shall never see. Again a civilization has vanished, but for the Sioux and Assiniboine, the blow was just as soul-deep. The elders, those who held the ceremonies, who remembered the oldest songs, who could trace kinship lines back 20 generations, were gone. And with them, The sacred chain of memory was broken, the oral history, the medicine bundles, the knowledge of star maps and migration paths, all scattered like ashes in the wind. Children wandered between the lodges, calling for parents who would not answer. In some camps, those too young to understand survival were taken in by neighboring tribes. In others, they simply disappeared into the woods, into rivers, into silence. But amid the loss, there was something else, something that refused to die. A girl of perhaps 14, face pitted from infection but alive, began to sing again. Her voice cracked, but it rose. It was the song of her grandmother, the one taught to her during the summer dance. Before the sickness came, she did not know all the words, but she sang anyway. In that broken melody, something stirred. In another camp, an old man, his eyes blinded by the fever, taught to boys how to tie a medicine bundle. Not because he had hope, but because it was all he had left to give. And there were others, those who remembered the plants that helped with fever, the roots that soothed the skin, the cedar that could purify a lodge. They gathered what they could, boiled water, prayed in darkness. They held fast, because to let go of tradition, even in despair, would mean true death. And so the sacred fires were kept alive, small, flickering embers in the belly of a continent. Still bleeding from unseen wounds, a Lakota warrior named Black Whirlwind, disfigured but standing, later said, "We were not defeated. We were tested. The buffalo did not leave us. The stars did not fall. The songs are quieter now, but they are still here." But make no mistake, the pain left scars deeper than the skin. Mistrust grew like thorns. Where once the traders were tolerated, even welcomed, now suspicion lingered. The American Fur Company, whose goods had once symbolized access and power, now bore the mark of contamination. Every blanket, every bottle, every handshake was a question. Was this the next plague? Would it come again? And from that mistrust, a new generation of resistance was born, not yet with rifles or war paint, but with memory, a resistance of preservation, of caution, of holding tighter to what remained. Even the land remembered. Places once used for gathering were abandoned. Sweat lodges were moved upriver. Vision quest sites, once vibrant, sat untouched for years. Yet slowly they returned, one by one, with caution, with reverence. And those who had survived, they carried the burden of story. They were the last living links to those who came before. A girl named White Raven became a keeper of names, reciting entire family lines each morning, so that she would not forget. An old man with no family left drew pictographs in the earth, recording in stone what was lost in flesh. One lodge wrapped in patched hides and surrounded by bones became a place of ceremony again. This was survival, not in the way of battles won or enemies slain. This was survival through memory, through language, through ritual, the invisible, weapons of a culture under siege. There would be other threats to come, other enemies, other tests. But none would come so quietly or cut so deep. To this day, some elders speak of the 1837 epidemic not just as a tragedy, but as a betrayal. Not merely a sickness of the body, but a sickness of trust, A lesson that the danger might not always wear a uniform or carry a gun. Sometimes it comes as a gift, as warmth, as a trade. And in that, a terrible wisdom was born. The wisdom to guard, to question, to remember. So when we speak now of survival, of how the Assiniboine and Sioux endured, we must speak not just of the hunts or the wars or the winters braved, but of the songs sung beside shallow graves, of the memories whispered to no one but the wind, of the lone survivors who lit fires again when all seemed lost. Because smallpox was an enemy without mercy, but the people were not without strength. The land never asked to be measured. It held no boundaries, no fences, no flags. It was wind and sky and earth, stretching far beyond the line of sight. For the Assiniboine and Sioux, it was not a possession but a living relative. Each valley, each river bend, each patch of prairie grass whispered stories known only to those who listened. But in 1851, men came with ink and parchment, and they carried not the voice of the land but the law of the distant East. At Fort Laramie, a stone outpost nestled along the banks of the North Platte River, representatives of the United States government gathered tribes from across the Great Plains. The promise was peace. The reality was something else entirely. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was presented as a grand agreement, a path toward coexistence between the United States and the native nations who had lived on this land since time before memory. The treaty offered recognition. It laid out hunting territories. It promised protection. The tribes, in turn, were asked to allow roads, forts, and settlers to pass unharmed. But behind the ink, behind the wax seals and ceremonial handshakes, was a truth already soaked in betrayal. The government had no intention of enforcing the boundaries it promised. And for the Assiniboine and Sioux, whose ancestral lands stretched far beyond the neat grid lines of the treaty map, what was being offered was not peace, but containment. Chiefs came to the treaty table with heavy hearts, some signed under duress, others in cautious hope, believing, perhaps, that through diplomacy they could slow the coming tide, that if they gave some land, they might save the rest, that if they agreed, their children might live in peace. They were wrong. By 1868, only 17 years later, a second treaty again at Fort Laramie was signed. This time, the terms were even narrower. The Sioux were promised the sacred Black Hills, the Powder River country, and a portion of the northern plains. The U.S. vowed to withdraw from certain forts, to cease hostilities. But even as ink dried, surveyors moved in. Railroad crews drove spikes into soil older than their own names. And the buffalo, once numbering in the tens of millions, vanished like smoke, not by accident, but by design. One U.S. official, General Philip Sheridan, infamously said, "Let them kill, skin and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." And so the slaughter began. Railroads hired hunters by the hundreds. Carcasses lined the tracks, left to rot in the sun, skulls piled in mountains. And with every buffalo that fell, a piece of the Sioux and Assiniboine way of life fell with it. because the treaties had not only carved up the land they had severed. The roots of survival, a Sioux elder once said, they gave us paper with promises. We gave them land with bones. The betrayal was not a single moment but a slow and steady bleed. The boundaries drawn by treaty were ignored. Almost as soon as they were set, white settlers poured in, laying claim to the very lands the U.S. government had vowed to protect. The military, meant to enforce the treaty lines, instead built more forts, each one a dagger pushed deeper into native soil. For the Assiniboine, whose territory extended from the northern plains into Canada, the treaties offered little recognition at all. Their fate was shaped more by what was ignored than what was signed, and yet they too felt the sting of broken trust. Missions were built, policies imposed, and traditional ways slowly stripped away, first by persuasion, then by force. But among the Sioux, the betrayal of the Black Hills cut the deepest. The 1868 treaty had declared them inviolable sacred land, to be left untouched. Yet when gold was discovered there in the 1870s, the U.S. government turned its back on every word it had written. Prospectors flooded in, the military returned, and when the Sioux resisted, they were branded as hostile enemies of a treaty the U.S. had already broken. The irony was cruel. To defend the land the government had promised them was now to commit an act of war. Chief Red Cloud, one of the most astute military leaders of the era, once stood before U.S. officials in Washington and held up a piece of paper. "You made us many promises," he said, "more than I can remember, but you kept only one. You promised to take our land, and you took it." Across the northern plains, elders gathered to discuss what could be done. Some counseled patience, others war. Some turned to spiritual renewal, reviving dances and ceremonies as shields against the erasure of their world. Others watched in silence, eyes heavy with the weight of too many funerals. Still, there were moments, quiet, defiant moments, where survival took a different shape. In one Assiniboine camp, a council refused to move despite the demands of Indian agents. They had not signed a treaty, they said, and they would not leave until the bones of their ancestors rose from the ground. For weeks, they lived under threat of removal until the agent, uncertain of how to proceed, backed down. In another case, a Sioux mother taught her daughter the stories of the buffalo hunts not as nostalgia, but as resistance. "They must live inside you now," she said, "because they no longer walk the earth." The treaties, for all their legal weight, were not agreements between equals. They were instruments of delay, wrapped in the language of diplomacy. And once they had served their purpose, they were discarded, but for the people whose signatures had been marked not with pens, but with the trust of their ancestors. Those betrayals cut deeper than any battlefield wound, because they were not only losing land, they were losing certainty, structure, the spiritual and practical framework that had held their world together for generations. The government spoke of progress, of civilization, of roads and schools and boundaries. But the Assiniboine and Sioux remembered something older. They remembered the rhythm of hooves across the plains, the song of wind through unbroken grass, the stars above the camps, unmoved by treaties, untouched by lies. And in that memory was a kind of survival that no paper could erase, even today. Those lines in the earth remain faint scars visible in old maps and modern borders. But the stories, the songs, the resistance they endure in ways the treaties never imagined. Because the land remembers who it belongs to, and no signature can change that dot the river still flowed, the grass still swayed in the wind. But the old life, the free life, was over by 1871. The northern plains no longer belonged to the buffalo or the people who had followed them for centuries. The treaties had drawn the lines. The soldiers had enforced them. And now, the U.S. government turned to a new tool, not a rifle, but a desk, not war paint, but paperwork. It was called the agency system. That year, the Fort Peck Indian Reservation was established, a vast stretch of prairie in northeastern Montana, where the Assiniboine and Sioux would now be confined. The Fort Peck Agency, a small compound of timber buildings and picket fences, was built not just to govern, but to remake a people to the government. It was policy. To the tribes, it was a reckoning. The reservation was more than a boundary. It was a cage with invisible bars made of ration schedules, crop quotas, school rosters, and Christian sermons. The old ways, hunting, wandering, teaching by firelight, had no place in the neat, orderly world the agency imagined. The people would be civilized, whether they agreed or not. But survival doesn't always wear feathers. Sometimes it speaks softly across a table. Sometimes it listens carefully before it speaks. And that's how the resistance began. When the first Indian agent, George W. Wilkinson, arrived at Fort Peck, he brought with him crates of surplus flour, bolts of calico, and a ledger thick with names he couldn't pronounce. The government had tasked him with transforming warriors into farmers, with breaking families into schoolrooms, with cutting braids and building chapels. But the Assiniboine and Sioux hadn't survived the smallpox, the treaty betrayals, and the loss of the buffalo by being blind. They knew the new fight wasn't with arrows, it was with rules, regulations, rations. They would need to adapt or they would vanish. The agency became a strange theater of contradictions. Each morning, men stood in lines outside the commissary, waiting for their monthly allotment of flour, sugar, coffee, and lard. Ration cards were punched by clerks in wool coats. Beside them stood native interpreters, young men who had learned English not by choice, but by necessity. They wore a foot in both worlds, one in tradition, one in the language of control. One of them was a man named to Knives, a Yanktonai Sioux raised in the old way but fluent in English and legalese. He became a vital bridge between the agent and the elders. He translated not just words but intentions, and in doing so, he protected what could still be saved. You must understand them to fight them, he told his son. You must know the shape of their knife before it is drawn. Each season, the government demanded progress. The people must farm, they said. They must live in cabins. They must abandon the dances, the sweat lodge, the sacred drum. But on the edges of the reservation, in the shadows beyond the agencies, reach, the old ways held on. Elders whispered star stories to grandchildren beneath lodge poles. A single buffalo skull was placed facing east at sunrise, not for worship, but to remember. Women wove grasses into patterns that told stories no agent could read. Ceremonies continued, hidden from the missionaries and inspectors. One winter, the agency tried to force the children into a government-run boarding school. The building was small, cold, and stiff with order. Hair was cut. Native names were replaced with English ones. And language Lakota, Nakota, Dakota was punished with lashes or silence. But not every child forgot. A girl named Red Willow learned to pray in English during the day and recite her grandmother's songs under her breath at night. She grew up, left the school, and taught her daughters both languages not as a compromise, but as a shield. Not every agency official was cruel. Some were simply blind to what they were erasing. Others were callous, dismissing sacred traditions as superstition. But just a few saw the strength in the people. One such man was Dr. Elias Banner, a government physician posted to Fort Peck in 1883. He arrived expecting poverty, disease, and despair. He found a community still burning with dignity. In his private journal, he wrote, "They say these people must be taught civility, but I have never seen such discipline, such care, such honor as when I attended their funerals. The whites do not understand who they are dealing with, and I fear they never will." Yet despite that dignity, the pressure never let up. The Bureau of Indian Affairs demanded quotas: how many acres were tilled, how many children enrolled, how many converted. The agency became a machine. Paperwork in, culture out, and when the buffalo were gone and the rations ran thin, starvation became a weapon. If a family resisted, if they refused to cut their hair, refused to send their children to school, they risked losing their food allotments. The threat was simple: comply or starve. But even then, resistance found a way. Some men turned to the river, fishing deep past curfews. Others hunted deer in secret. Despite the risk of punishment, women gathered roots and medicinal herbs, often pretending they were collecting firewood. Every act of survival became a quiet rebellion, and inside the agency's own walls, the battle for identity continued. There were meetings, councils, where tribal leaders sat across from government officials. The air tense with unspoken truths. Men like Red Elk, an Assiniboine leader with piercing eyes and a voice like gravel, sat silently through hours of policy talk, and then stood, speaking slowly in English. "We are not children. We are not wards. We are nations. You may write your laws, but we remember who we are." And they did. The agency could not stop the sun from rising. It could not stop the people from singing quietly as they walked the prairie. It could not erase memory from blood by the late 1880s. Changes had begun to take root not just from the government, but from within. The people were adapting, not surrendering, but reshaping. Tribal councils began to form, not imposed from above, but built from within. Leadership passed not just through war parties, but through knowledge, language, diplomacy. The role of interpreters grew. Some became politicians, others spiritual leaders. They moved through to worlds, carrying memory like fire cupped in their hands. The Fort Peck Agency remained a symbol of control. Yes, but also a strange crucible. Inside its fences, culture was not extinguished. It was tempered, hammered, hardened. Because in every ration line, there was a story. In every torn ledger, a name. And in every name, a legacy that refused to be buried beneath bureaucracy. The agency may have risen with the aim of breaking a people, but instead it became the place where the people learned to bend without breaking. The snow had not yet melted from the coulees when word spread across the camp's buffalo. East of the Little Porcupine, a small herd, perhaps 50, maybe less. For a people whose lives had once followed the great migrations like a heartbeat, it was the sound of hope, distant, fragile, but alive. This was no ordinary hunt. It was something else, a gathering of memory, a farewell. By the spring of 1883, the buffalo were nearly gone, slaughtered by the millions, their bones piled like monuments to greed. The thundering herds that had once blackened the prairie from horizon to horizon had been reduced to scattered remnants, darting like ghosts between railroads and ranch fences. The government had not just allowed the killing, they had encouraged it. They knew that to starve the buffalo was to starve the people who followed them. But this one last hunt, organized by leaders from the Fort Peck Sioux and Assiniboine, was not about meat alone. It was about memory, about dignity. It was a final communion between a people and the animal that had shaped their world. The old hunters gathered first, men with names like Hollow Elk, Iron Knife, and Red Hair. They met in silence near a stand of cottonwood trees, passing a pipe beneath a sky that had watched over generations. Around them, younger men readied horses, sharpened lances, checked the sinew bindings on old bows that had not been drawn in years. Some of them had never hunted buffalo before. A woman named Blacktail described watching her two sons prepare. They wore their grandfather's feathers, she said, as if it would bring back his strength. But their eyes were wide with worry. They had only heard the stories. This was the first time they would live one. The elders insisted on ceremony. Before the riders moved out, they sang the old hunt songs that spoke to the buffalo spirit. Asking permission, offering respect, they painted their horses with sacred symbols, smudged their hands and cheeks with ash. It wasn't superstition. It was survival of identity, of rhythm, of meaning. The sun broke through the clouds as the scouts returned. The herd was small, lean from winter, scattered in a frozen basin beyond a shallow ridge. But they were real, breathing, moving, not yet stories. And so, just before dawn, the riders moved. It was not a grand charge across the plains. There were no war cries or thundering hooves on endless grass. This was different, quieter, measured. The buffalo were wary. Years of gunfire had taught them to run at the scent of man. But these hunters did not come with repeating rifles. They came on horseback, with bows, with tradition. They moved in from both sides, an old pincer maneuver, taught from father to son over countless winters. At first, the herd spooked and scattered. But a few bulls turned, instinct carrying them into the hunt path. That was when the dust rose. Hollow Elk led the first charge. His mounted chestnut gelding bred from one of the last pure herds leapt through the sage with practiced urgency. He loosed 2 arrows before the others caught up, each one finding its mark behind a bull's shoulder. He did not cheer, he did not smile, he simply nodded and turned to help the younger riders finish what had begun. The hunt lasted less than an hour. By the end, 12 buffalo lay on the ground, each one blessed, thanked, and skinned with reverence. Not a scrap was wasted. The meat was bundled, the hides carefully rolled. Even the sinew was preserved for thread. A single horn was carved on the spot into a ladle for a newborn. But behind every motion was an ache, because the people knew this would be the last. After the killing was done, the riders sat around a small fire and sang again. This time not the HUNT song, but the goodbye song, a dirge for the old world, for the days of movement, of self-sufficiency, of freedom beneath an open sky. One rider, a boy no older than 16, wept openly. His name was White Calf. It was his first buffalo. It would be his last. I did not know what we were losing, he later said, until I held its heart in my hands. News of the hunt spread quickly across the reservation. Elders who could no longer ride came to see the hides, to run their fingers across the coarse hair, to smell the blood and fat and smoke that had once been their daily life. They told stories of times when the earth shook beneath hooves, when meat was so plentiful it was dried on long racks across the ridges, when children played inside the rib cages of carcasses 3 days old. One grandmother, blind from age, asked to be brought to the hides. She knelt beside one, placed her palm upon it, and whispered its name, Tatanka. The buffalo were not just animals. They were the source of everything: food, tools, shelter, ceremony. Their bones made knives, their hides made lodges, their sinew strung the boughs that fed villages. Their spirits taught humility, sacrifice, and strength. To hunt buffalo was to know your place in the world, not above, but within it. And now, that world was closing. The U.S. government would soon ban all buffalo hunting for native populations. The few herds left were pushed into Yellowstone or private ranches. The open plains became cattle land, railway land, farmland, anything but what it had been. The last hunt was not marked by banners or treaties or battles. It was marked by a silence that came after the songs had faded. A knowing stillness. The Fort Peck hunters returned not in triumph, but in mourning. And yet, even then, something remained. A piece of hide was cut and tanned, then wrapped around a cedar stick and painted with red ochre. It was kept in a medicine bundle and passed down for generations, not for its use but for its memory. That hide still exists. It lives not in a museum, but in a house on the reservation, above a child's bed, as a whisper of who they were and what they carried forward, because survival is not always loud. Sometimes it is a single hunt, a final ride, a heartbeat passed down through blood. The buffalo are gone, but the people are not. And in the dust left behind by that last gallop, something sacred still stirs. They came in wagons. Some came on trains. Others were taken on foot, lined up in rows. herded like livestock beneath a grey sky. The children of Fort Peck, some no older than 4 or 5, torn from the arms of mothers who could do nothing but wail into the wind. Their crime was not disobedience. It was identity. By the late 1880s, the United States had turned its focus from warfare to assimilation. The battlefield moved from open plains to schoolrooms, from rifles to rulers. And at the heart of this new campaign was the Indian boarding school across the northern plains. Government officials called Indian agents enforced mandatory education policies. Children were rounded up, often by threat of starvation or imprisonment. Some parents resisted. Others, broken by years of pressure, surrendered their children with trembling hands and hollow eyes. The Fort Peck children were sent far, sometimes to schools hundreds of miles from home. Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Genoa in Nebraska, Pipestone in Minnesota, and later to the Fort Peck boarding school itself, built near Poplar. Brick walls, iron beds, uniforms, English. Always English when they arrived. The first thing they lost was their name. A boy known as Weacopy, meaning feather, falls in Nakota, became Charles. A girl called to Kalila Wickenoppy, grandfather's star, became Mary. Their hair was cut, their clothes burned, their language forbidden. One child, remembered only in tribal stories as Small Hawk, tried to run after his braids, were cut. He made it 5 miles before collapsing from cold and exhaustion. He was brought back, lashed and locked in a basement. His only comfort a smooth buffalo tooth he had hidden in his moccasin. Survivors recall the sound of silence being enforced. If a child was caught speaking Lakota or Assiniboine, they were slapped or forced to wash their mouths with lye. Some were denied food, others were isolated for days. They wanted to cut our tongues out with their rules. One elder recalled in an oral interview years later, but they could not reach the songs in our bones. The education itself was not meant to uplift but to erase. Boys were trained as laborers, farmhands, cobblers, janitors. Girls were made into maids, cooks, laundresses. Their future was not envisioned as sovereign or free, but as obedient servants to white society. They were taught that their families were ignorant, that their religion was savage, that their ancestors were mistakes to be corrected. The trauma ran deep. One survivor, Elizabeth Ironcloud, remembered being forbidden from writing home. I was 6 years old. They said my mother could not write English, so there was no point in sending letters. I used to whisper to the trees at night, hoping the wind would carry my words back to her. Many children never returned. Some died of illness, tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza while confined in cold, overcrowded dormitories. Others perished from abuse or from the ache of abandonment. The cemeteries near the schools grew steadily, marked with numbers instead of names. At Fort Peck, some parents walked for days to bring their children back. They pleaded, protested. Some were arrested, others were simply ignored. Yet amidst this grim machinery, resistance bloomed in the smallest, quietest ways. At night, under the covers, children whispered to one another in their mother tongue. Short phrases, pet names, sacred words, Ina, Teate, Ska, Language became rebellion. Remembering became survival. Older students smuggled stories like contraband, passing them to the younger ones. In lullabies and drawings, scratched into wooden bedposts or whispered between chores. Girls braided symbols into each other's hair patterns that elders had once woven into porcupine quillwork. Boys etched petroglyphs onto stones behind the school. And when the teachers weren't watching, some sang. The songs were soft, half-remembered, fragments of old ceremonies, prayer songs, honor songs, grieving songs. They were not sung for applause, but for memory, to keep something breathing in a place built to kill. One boy, his English name was Thomas, was caught singing in Lakota behind the dormitory. The school punished him with solitary confinement. He emerged silent, but with a single phrase scratched into the wall. Mitakuyo Yasi, we are all related. Back home, the grandparents waited. The children who returned were often changed. Some no longer understood their own language. Some refused to wear traditional clothes. Some had nightmares. Some would not speak at all. A grandmother named Elk woman once said, I met my grandson again at age 15. He bowed instead of greeting me. He looked through me as if I was a stranger. That night, I lit a fire and sang the songs his mother used to sing. He didn't sing with me, but he cried. The boarding school era fractured more than families. It tore at the heart of tribal continuity. Oral tradition passed down through generations was broken mid-sentence. Ceremonies forgotten. Kinship terms lost. An entire worldview, translated into English, lost its soul. Yet still, not everything was lost. In secret lodges, in moonlit camps beyond the agency's reach, in beadwork and lullabies and bundles hidden beneath floorboards, the culture endured. A woman named Daisy Red Elk, a boarding school survivor, would later become a language teacher on the Fort Peck Reservation. They tried to make me forget, she said, but I made remembering my life's work. She taught Nakota to children whose grandparents had once been punished for speaking it. She stitched her school books by hand. She started each lesson with a song her own mother had sung in whispers. Behind a government dormitory, that same song, later recorded on tape, became the intro melody for a Fort Peck cultural program broadcast in the 1980s. The boarding schools closed slowly, some in the 1930s, others not until the 1970s. Their buildings decayed, their windows shattered, their playgrounds were reclaimed by prairie grass, but the echoes remained. Today, the descendants walk among those ruins. They place their palms on the bricks, listen to the wind, and speak names aloud that were once forbidden. The wounds are deep, but so is the will to heal. Language classes, immersion programs, elders teaching under trees, drums resounding in school gymnasiums that once forbade them, and stories, so many stories, told not as tragedies alone, but as testaments, proof that even when a people is broken, they are not defeated. We carry their silence like a burden. One student said during a tribal graduation ceremony, but now we speak louder because they could not. And as the Fort Peck sun rises over the plains once more, there is still pain, still memory, but also a sound that once risked extinction, now flowing freely once again. a child laughing in Nakota. The wind across the Montana prairie once carried only the sounds of hooves and drums, of laughter rising from lodges, and the hush of grass beneath moccasins. But by the turn of the 20th century, that wind carried something else, a distant hum, a warning. Metal on metal, iron rails humming like a blade drawn across the land. The Great Northern Railway was coming. Steel tracks, laid by immigrant hands and driven by government ambition, slashed through the Fort Peck lands like veins of cold ambition. For the Assiniboine and Sioux, the tracks weren't progress, they were a wound, a scar of permanence across a landscape that had once been shared, circular, alive. The train didn't ask permission, it brought settlers, surveyors, speculators, all armed with deeds and maps that had no roots in the soil. And as the iron serpent pushed westward, it wasn't just the buffalo that vanished, it was the shape of a homeland. Fences soon followed, barbed wire cheap, cruel, and efficient, strung in long, unbending lines across rolling grassland. The open range was now a patchwork. What had once been a world of kinship and movement became a grid of ownership and exclusion. Grazing trails were cut off, sacred sites hemmed in, water sources fenced behind, property signs written in a language foreign to those who still spoke. In stories, the federal government called it order, but for the people of Fort Peck, it felt like strangulation. The land that remained was no longer tribal in the old sense. It had been sliced by legislation, stamped by bureaucracy, and legalized by ink, none of which the people had asked for. In 1887, the Dawes Act changed everything. Marketed as a solution to the so-called Indian problem, the Dawes Act broke up communal lands and allotted individual plots, 160 acres for each head of household, 80 for single adults, 40 for children. What was left, surplus land, was opened for white settlement. The law spoke of integration, self-sufficiency, and citizenship, but what it did was dissolve sovereignty. Overnight, land that had been shared for generations became fragmented, fenced, and vulnerable to sale. The communal turned personal, and the personal was easily lost. Some families, unfamiliar with English law or manipulated by speculators, signed away their plots for a sack of flour or a used plow. Others were tricked into selling by false documents. A few fought it, but the laws weren't written for their protection. By 1910, nearly two-thirds of the original Fort Peck land base had passed into non-native hands. The reservation was still there on paper, but on the ground it looked like a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table. Railroad easements crisscrossed traditional hunting grounds. Homesteads appeared near burial sites. Oil scouts walked across the land with drilling maps, and promises of wealth, promises that rarely reached the people who stood on that soil. And yet, amid this dismantling, there were those who fought back not with guns, but with grit. One such man was Thomas Red Fox, an Assiniboine rancher who spoke fluent English, but never forgot the sound of council fires. When he received his allotment, he didn't sell. He built not just a home, but a legacy. He taught his children to read land deeds, to understand survey lines. He traveled to Washington, D.C., twice before the age of 40 to petition for tribal land protections. He once said, "They've made the law their weapon, so we will learn it and bend it back." Others followed. In the 1920s and 30s, Fort Peck leaders began buying back land acre by acre from homesteaders who had failed to make it on the dry prairie. Some tribal members pooled resources. Others negotiated through newly formed tribal councils, slowly reigniting fragments of land into something whole again. It wasn't just about acres, it was about memory. Each recovered piece of land was a returned heartbeat, a stream restored, a burial ground protected from the shadow of oil derricks, a space where a child could run without hearing the hum of a freight train in the distance. But the battle was slow. The Dawes Act, combined with the later Burke Act, and waves of forced leasing, kept the land bleeding. Fractionation became a curse, parcels passed down through generations, until a single acre might have 100 heirs, none of whom could farm or build without the approval of the rest. Bureaucracy became the new weapon. Maps became war zones. Government maps showed boundaries, parcels, rail lines, and ownership in cold black ink. But tribal maps, oral, spiritual, living, told a different story. They spoke of buffalo crossings, of medicine wheel sites, of buried grounds and eagle nests, places not marked by fences, but by memory. Elders began walking these lands with grandchildren, not just to teach them where to hunt, but where to belong. They pointed out where the old trails ran, now swallowed by wheat fields, where the sun touched the ridges just right during the sun dance, where their own fathers had seen the last wild herds pass. "This is still ours," one elder whispered, standing beside a railroad cut. "Even if they don't draw it that way." In time, new tools joined the fight. Legal teams, land recovery programs, environmental surveys, tribal land corporations. A younger generation, fluent in both GIS software and traditional stories, took up the mantle. They studied land law in college. They returned home. They filed claims, challenged illegal leases. They redrew maps not to erase the past, but to reclaim it. And still, the wind blows across Fort Peck. It moves over train tracks now rusting in the sun, over old barbed fences broken by storms, over new tribal bison herds roaming where once only cattle stood. Progress came in strange shapes. Some of it left scars, some brought opportunity, and some was reshaped by those who refused to let go of the land that had made them. Today, from the air, Fort Peck still looks fractured. But when you walk it, when you listen, you hear something older than the fences, older than the rails. You hear footsteps echoing along old trails, voices naming rivers in the tongue that first spoke them, prayers rising from places long thought forgotten. The land remembers, and the people, despite everything, are still here to remember with it. The morning sun rose over the eastern hills of Fort Peck, casting long shadows across a quiet land that had endured so much loss of buffalo, of language, of land itself. But as the world beyond the reservation stirred with global conflict, a new chapter began to take shape, one written not in treaties or land deeds, but in blood and bravery. It started with the sound of boots in gravel, with a handshake at the train station, with the slow wave of a mother as her son, just 17, stepped into a uniform stitched by the very government that had tried to erase his people. His name was Joseph Tall Iron. In 1917, Joseph became one of the first Fort Peck Assiniboine to enlist in the Great War. He'd never been east of Dakota Territory, but he carried something older than any border honor, tradition, and the blood of generations of warriors. He wasn't alone. Across the reservation, word spread. Young men, some barely out of boarding school, others hardened by winters and workhorse plows lined up to serve. The army called them Indians. The newspapers called them noble. But their own families simply called them Wicasta. Men who would fight, not just for America, but for the memory of their grandfathers, who once rode against Custer. It was a paradox few could explain. Fighting for a country that had broken its promises, saluting a flag that once waved over the theft of their homeland. Yet still, they went, not out of blind loyalty but out of something deeper. We had no treaty with the Kaiser, one elder later said, but we knew what it meant when a people tried to crush another into silence. The war took them far. To the trenches of France, to the forests of Belgium, to the cold, muddy fields of the Somme. They faced mustard gas, machine gun fire, and months without rest. And still they carried themselves with dignity. Joseph Tall Iron sent a letter home in the winter of 1918. It was written in a mix of broken English and Dakota. We hear the thunder not of sky, but of man. But I remember the old songs. I sing them. Before sleep, my spirit walks with you even here. He returned from the war limping, with a French medal in one pocket and a piece of shrapnel near his spine. He wore both with pride. More than 250 men from Fort Peck served in World War I. When World War II came, even more would follow. By 1941, their sons had come of age. A new generation of warriors stepped forward. This time, it was not horses and bows, but tanks, rifles, and radio signals. Names like Leonard to Dog's Red Elk, Harold Charging Bear, and William Black Pipe became part of the enlistment rolls. They served in Europe, the Pacific, North Africa. Some joined elite code talker units. Others served in logistics, medical, artillery. They were scattered across continents, but they carried Fort Peck in every breath. Leonard Red Elk served in Italy. In a rare journal entry, he wrote, "The bullets do not ask where I am from, but I fight with a name older than theirs." There was pride in that, and pain. Back home, the reservation faced rations and worry. Mothers waited by radios. Children looked to maps pinned on classroom walls, tracing the oceans where their brothers had gone. Some received telegrams. Others received only silence. But the war also brought change. When the men returned, they brought with them more than medals. They brought stories of cities, of nations, of what it meant to belong and what it meant to be denied. They came back with questions. Why fight for a country that still denied their right to vote? Why die in uniform when their land could still be leased without their consent? They came back sharper, wiser, determined. One veteran, Edward Whitefeather, organized the first tribal petition against illegal land leases in 1946. He said, "They taught us to fight tyranny in Europe, so we brought that fight home. Others became leaders, translators, educators. They founded veterans groups, organized community events, and spoke up at agency meetings that once silenced their fathers. The military had taught them discipline, strategy, and self-respect. Now they applied those same lessons to sovereignty. It was not easy. Some struggled with what we now call PTSD. Others faced racism in towns where they'd once been barred from stores. They found themselves in a strange limbo, respected as veterans, yet still treated as second-class citizens. Yet through it all, they stood tall. Fort Peck built memorials not just of stone, but of memory. Ceremonies were held, songs were revived. Veterans were honored with feathers and dances, wrapped in star quilts, their names etched into community halls. But perhaps their greatest contribution wasn't what they did during war, it was what they inspired after it. The returning warriors sparked a fire that would blaze through the second half of the 20th century. Their children would become activists, council members, lawyers. They would lead land recovery movements, language, revitalization efforts, and resistance to harmful federal policies. They laid the groundwork for what would become the modern tribal sovereignty movement. "My father fought Hitler," said Marie Gray Hawk, a Fort Peck activist in the 1970s. "So I could fight the beer." In the years that followed, Fort Peck would see lawsuits, land claims, and cultural revivals, all with the spirit of those warriors behind them. Their service had been more than patriotic, it had been prophetic. Because in learning how to fight abroad, they remembered how to stand at home. Today, in the Fort Peck tribal offices, a wall displays the faces of those who served, grainy photos, folded flags, dog tags. But beyond the frames is something greater, a legacy of strength, of contradiction, yes, but also of clarity. These were men and women who did not see themselves as victims. They were survivors, fighters, builders of something that refused to die. The sound of drums once silenced now echoes louder. The languages once punished are now taught in classrooms. The descendants of those warriors now wear suits and regalia, speak English and Nakota, walk in both worlds with pride in both. Because when the warriors returned, they didn't just come back from war. They came home to rebuild a nation within a nation. One scarred, but still breathing. One wounded, but still rising. And in the rising sun over Fort Peck, you can still hear the echoes of footsteps and battle cries, not of conquest, but of return. The wind never stopped moving across the plains of Fort Peck. But in the summer of 1934, something else stirred. Not the thunder of bison, not the rattle of war ponies or the hiss of steam trains. It